Abigail Hartwell found out she was being sent away the same morning. Her father sat down to a full breakfast. He didn't stand up. He didn't put down his fork. He looked at her across the table, his 26-year-old daughter standing in the doorway in her house dress, and said, with the same flat calm he used to discuss freight prices, "I've arranged for you to go north. A rancher needs help. You leave Friday." Then he cut his ham and kept eating, like he hadn't just sold her. If this is your first time here, before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you've never subscribed to this channel, do it now, because what happens to this woman over the next 5 parts is something you do not want to miss, even 1 minute of. Stay with me until the very end. Let's go. "Is that all you're going to say?" Abigail asked. Her father set his fork down. Slowly. The way a man does when he's decided he's being interrupted and wants you to know it. "What else is there to say?" Silas Hartwell folded his hands on the table. He was dressed already, pressed shirt, gold watch chain catching the morning light. Because Silas Hartwell was always dressed, always composed, always performing the role of a man with everything in order. "I've made an arrangement. It's a good one. You should be grateful." "You arranged my life," she said, without asking me. "I arranged an opportunity." He picked his fork back up. "There's a difference." "What's his name?" "Caleb Whitaker, cattle rancher, north of the Missouri. He's decent, by all accounts." "How old is he?" "Old enough to need help, and young enough to be useful to you." He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "You're 26, Abigail. I've done what I can. 3 men, 3 introductions, and every one of them—" He stopped himself, set his jaw. "You're not getting younger. This is what's available." Abigail stood very still in the doorway. She had spent her entire life in this house, learning to read the particular silences her father left around his cruelest sentences. She understood what "this is what's available" meant. She understood what 3 men, 3 introductions meant when said in that tone, in that order. She understood all of it. "You told them something," she said. "Before they met me. You told them something that made sure they wouldn't." Silas Hartwell did not answer. Which was his answer? "Papa." Her voice was quiet, not trembling. Quiet in the way of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. "Did you describe me honestly to this man? To Mr. Whitaker?" Her father looked up from his plate. His eyes were the pale, careful eyes of a man who had convinced himself that every decision he made was reasonable. "I described you accurately," he said. "That's not the same thing." "Abigail, what did you write?" The silence stretched. "I wrote that you were a woman of ordinary ability," he said finally. "Limited prospects, that you had shown little ambition in the domestic arts and were not well suited to society." He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, regretful but firm, as though the facts themselves were the problem and not the man stating them. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. She felt something happen inside her chest. Not breaking. She'd been broken before, had learned the geography of that particular damage. This was different. This was something hardening. Something that had been soft and hoping for a long time, finally deciding it was done with softness. "You wrote that to a stranger," she said, "about your own daughter." "I wrote the truth as I see it." "No." Her voice was still quiet, still steady. "You wrote the story you've been telling yourself for 26 years, so you wouldn't have to feel bad about how you treated me." Silas Hartwell's jaw tightened. "That's enough." "Is it?" She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she rarely allowed herself to, because it always hurt too much. The pressed shirt, the gold watch chain, the man who had stood at the front of 2 churches beaming at 2 daughters who married well, and who flinched when anyone asked him about the 3rd. "I'll go, Papa. I'll go because I want to, not because you arranged it. And I want you to understand something before I walk out that door." He didn't look away, but his hands stilled on the table. "I'm not going because I'm what you say I am," she said. "I'm going because I'm done letting you be the one who decides." She turned and walked out of the dining room. She did not go back to say goodbye. She went upstairs, packed her trunk, and was ready before he finished his breakfast. Margaret found her on the landing, trunk at her feet, waiting for the wagon. Her older sister looked at the trunk, then at Abigail, then back at the trunk, the way people look at things they want to pretend they're not seeing. "You could write to us," Margaret offered, "when you're settled." "Could I?" Abigail said. Margaret pressed her lips together. "Abby, did you know?" Abigail asked. "About the letter he wrote? What he told Mr. Whitaker about me?" The pause was a fraction too long. "Papa does what he thinks is best," Margaret said. "That's not what I asked." "Abby, don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not making anything," Abigail said. "I'm asking you a question. Did you know what he wrote about me to that man?" Margaret looked at the wall. Her jaw moved like she was choosing between two different sentences. "You'll be fine," she said finally. You're capable. You always figure things out." "Yes," Abigail said. "I do." The wagon pulled up outside. She could hear the driver calling from the yard. She lifted her trunk herself. It was heavier than it looked. She'd packed her mother's recipe book, her sewing tin, 2 dresses, a Bible with a cracked spine that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything that had ever made her feel like herself. She was bringing all of it, because she had decided, the night before, lying awake staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling. Wherever she was going as herself. Not the version her father had written about. Not the version the town whispered about. Herself. She carried the trunk down the stairs without asking for help. She walked past the dining room without looking in. She crossed the front porch and went down the steps to where the wagon driver, a short weathered man named Holt, was waiting with his hat pulled low. He glanced at her size, at her trunk, at the set of her face, and apparently decided nothing needed saying, because he simply took the trunk and loaded it without comment. She climbed up onto the bench herself, settled her skirts, folded her hands in her lap. From the upstairs window, she could see the edge of her father's study curtain shift. He'd come that far, watching from upstairs rather than standing on the porch, which was, she supposed, the most honest version of their relationship she'd ever been shown. She looked at the road ahead. She did not look back. Not once. Not for any of it. The wagon rolled north for 2 full days. Holt was not a man who talked, which suited her. He shared his coffee in the mornings without being asked, and passed dried meat at midday without ceremony, and that was the full extent of their interaction, except for the practical. How much further? Weather looks to hold. Creek crossing coming up. She spent those hours thinking. Not about what she'd left. She was finished with that, or was working on being finished with it, which she understood was not the same thing, but was the necessary first step. She thought instead about what she was going toward. What she knew about Caleb Whitaker, which was almost nothing. Widower. Cattle rancher. North of the Missouri River. Needed someone to manage the domestic operations of the ranch. Had responded to her father's letter with a careful, businesslike note through a mutual contact. She had not been shown that note. She hadn't asked to see it. She thought about what her father had written. Ordinary ability. Limited prospects. Not suited to society. She turned the words over in her mind the way she turned difficult things over, not flinching away from them, but examining them, testing their edges, asking herself honestly, is any of it true? Her ability was not ordinary. She knew this the same way she knew anything she'd examined carefully, without arrogance, but without false modesty either. She was quick with numbers. She understood systems, how things connected, where they broke down, what a small adjustment in one place could do to the whole. She had a memory for detail that other people seemed to find unusual. She read voraciously and retained most of what she read. These were not ordinary abilities. Her father had simply never found them useful for his purposes, which meant, in his accounting, they did not count, not suited to society. That one she turned over longer. She was not suited to the particular society her father valued. The parlor conversations, the careful performances of femininity, the understanding that a woman's worth resided in her ability to attract the right kind of attention and then manage it gracefully. She had never been able to do that. She was too direct, too serious, too physically substantial for the role she was supposed to play. But society was a larger thing than Silas Hartwell's dining room. And she was going somewhere new. She looked at the country opening up around her. The enormous Montana sky, the rolling grass, the mountains in the far distance, enormous and indifferent and magnificent. And she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Then she recognized it. She felt possible. The Whitaker Ranch appeared in the late afternoon of the second day, coming over a rise in the land, and it was larger than she'd imagined. The main house 2 stories, weathered timber but solid, a wide covered porch across the front. Behind it a barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a windmill turning slowly in the warm breeze. Fences running clean and straight across the land. The whole operation had the look of a place that had been built with serious intention and was fighting, against time and weather and the particular entropy of working land, to maintain it. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted it to. Stop it, she told herself. Pay attention. Look at what's actually here. So she looked. She catalogued. She assessed. She did what she always did when she was frightened. She turned her attention outward, toward what could be learned, because learning was always something she could do, regardless of what else was happening. Holt pulled the wagon to a stop near the front of the house. The door opened before she could decide what to do next. A man came down the porch steps. Tall, well over 6 feet, with the build of someone who had done hard physical work for many years, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed, though the lines around his eyes and the hard set of his jaw put age on him in ways that had nothing to do with years. Dark hair under a worn hat, several days of stubble, and eyes, when he got close enough that she could see them clearly, that were a sharp, clear gray. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her. Not the way she was used to being looked at. Not the quick inventory, weight, face, deportment. The flicker of calculation and disappointment that men tried to hide behind politeness. He looked at her the way a careful, serious person looks at something they genuinely want to understand. Like she was a map of territory he hadn't been to yet, and he intended to read it properly. It was the most unsettling look she'd ever received, because she had no idea what conclusion he was drawing. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who didn't speak unless he had something to say. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He came forward and held out his hand to help her down from the wagon. She took it. His grip was steady, and he released it the moment her feet were on the ground. No performance, no ceremony. He simply helped her down. A person helps another person, and then stepped to a respectful distance. "Long trip," he said. "2 days," she replied. "It wasn't bad. You hungry?" "I could eat." He nodded once. Then he reached past her, lifted her trunk from the wagon bed with one arm. She noticed he made nothing of its weight, just picked it up and tucked it under his arm like it was nothing, and nodded toward the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you around." Inside, the house told her everything she needed to know about who he was and how he had been living. It was clean. She gave him that immediately. It was not the disaster of a man who had given up. Every surface was functional. The floors were swept. The dishes were stacked. But there was nothing in that house that wasn't strictly necessary. No curtains, no rug, no pictures on the walls except a single framed map of Montana territory hanging in the main room, like the one thing he'd decided he needed to see. The furniture was plain and heavy and arranged with the logic of a man who thought about efficiency and had stopped thinking about anything else. It was the house of someone who had learned to live without comfort, because comfort reminded him of something he couldn't have anymore. She filed that away. She said nothing about it. Caleb set her trunk down at the base of the stairs and turned to face her. "Your room's upstairs," he said. "Second door on the right. East-facing window. Warm in the morning, cooler in the afternoon." He crossed his arms loosely across his chest, not defensively, just the posture of a man who was used to standing in the middle of large spaces. Kitchens through there, pantries organized. A woman named Mrs. Dole managed the house for 6 years, kept good records. She moved back east last spring. I've been managing since. A pause. Meals at 6, noon and 6. Hands eat in the bunkhouse. I eat here. All right, she said. Kitchen, pantry, the house. Arrange it however suits you best. If you need something we don't have, tell me, and I'll get it. That's fair, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That same careful attention. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded letter. He held it without offering it immediately. Your father wrote to me, he said, before you came. I know, she said. I want you to read it. He held it out. You have a right to know what he said. She looked at the letter in his hand. She felt the particular quality of dread she'd carried her entire life around her father's words. The weight of them, the way they landed in a room and changed the air. How bad? She asked. He didn't soften it. Bad enough that I want you to see for yourself. So we're starting from the same place. She took it, unfolded it, read it. It took under a minute. Her father wrote with the economy of a man conducting business. No sentiment wasted, no room left for misinterpretation. A woman of ordinary ability. Limited prospects. Little ambition in the domestic arts. Not suited to society. The implication threaded through every line. I am sending you a problem. I apologize in advance. Do not expect much. He had signed it with his full name and his business address. Like she was a shipment of damaged goods. She folded the letter back along its creases. She handed it back to Caleb. My father, she said, and her voice came out very steady, steadier than she expected, has spent 26 years deciding what I am. I spent 2 days on that wagon deciding I'm done letting him. She met his gray eyes directly. I don't know what I can do for this ranch yet. I'd rather show you than tell you. But I want you to know, whatever that letter says, it is not a description of me. It's a description of his disappointment. Those are not the same thing. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, slow and careful, like a cloud shadow crossing open ground. Not pity. She would have turned around and gotten back on the wagon for pity. It was something closer to recognition. All right, he said quietly. He put the letter back in his pocket. Supper doesn't need to be complicated tonight, he said. Whatever's easy. I'll manage, she said. I took his hat from the hook by the door, put it on, and walked back outside. She stood alone in the main room for a moment after the door closed behind him. Just stood there, breathing. Then she picked up her trunk and carried it upstairs. The east-facing room was plain and clean, with an iron-frame bed and a washstand and the window he'd described. Wide, overlooking the north pasture and the line of mountains beyond. She set her trunk down. She unpacked carefully, hanging her 2 dresses, setting the recipe book on the windowsill where she could see it, placing the Bible on the nightstand. She arranged her sewing tin on the dresser. Small things. Her things. In this room. She looked at the mountains through the window. All right, she thought. Let's see what this place is. She found the kitchen in better condition than she'd dared to hope. Mrs. Dole had been a serious woman. The pantry proved it. Organized by category, labeled in careful handwriting, dry goods sealed against mice, preserves arranged by date, a crock of salt pork, flour and cornmeal in their bins. She moved through it slowly, touching things, reading labels, building a picture of what she had to work with. She cataloged and she planned, and then she built a fire in the cook stove and went to work. Salt pork soup, cornbread, simple. But she seasoned the soup with dried herbs from a small tin near the back of the pantry, tasted it twice, adjusted, tasted again. She wiped down the table while things cooked. Set 2 places, then stopped herself. She didn't know the protocol. She left both settings and decided to follow his lead. He came in at exactly 6. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at the stove. He took off his hat. Smells like something real, he said. Salt pork soup, she said. Cornbread. I didn't have time for anything more involved tonight. Didn't ask for anything more involved. He sat down. She brought the soup, set the cornbread between them, sat across from him. He served himself without ceremony and began to eat. After 4 or 5 spoonfuls, he set his spoon down. He looked at her. "Your father's letter said limited domestic ability," he said. "My father's letter," she said, "was written by a man who never once came into the kitchen." Caleb picked up his spoon again. Fair point. They ate. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were both paying attention to the same thing for different reasons, which is a particular kind of quiet that takes a certain type of person to be comfortable inside. Outside, the last light was going out of the Montana sky. A coyote started up somewhere far to the east. The windmill turned. The ranch settled into dark. "The house," Abigail said after a while. "Mrs. Dole kept good records in the pantry, but there's a storage room off the back." "That room's a disaster," Caleb said. He said it flatly, without embarrassment. Statement of fact. "I noticed. I'd like to go through it." "Go through it however you want." He tore a piece of cornbread. "If you find anything worth saving, save it. Anything that's gone, discard it." "There might be goods in there you don't know about," she said. "Things that got buried." He looked up at her. "Mrs. Dole always said she thought the inventory was off," he said slowly. "I'd like to find out," Abigail said. He held her gaze for a moment. "All right. And the water troughs," she said. "The eastern ones, near the far pasture. I noticed the color coming in today. I could be wrong, but I'd want to look at them tomorrow." The spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down. "What did you notice?" he asked. His voice had changed. Not sharper exactly, but more present. Like something had come alert behind his eyes. "Greenish tinge at the edges," she said. "Could be algae. Could be something further upstream. I don't know cattle the way you do, but I know what clean water looks like." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "How long were you looking at those troughs?" "About 30 seconds, she said. "Coming up the road." He stared at her. She stared back, evenly. "I'll send Jimmy and Caro up there first thing tomorrow," he said. "I'd appreciate it," she said. "I'd rather be wrong and know it than not ask." He picked his spoon back up. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, looking at the table. "Your father's letter," he said, without looking up. "Yes?" "I read it 4 times, he said, trying to understand how a man describes his own daughter that way. Abigail was quiet. "I still don't understand it," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I stopped trying about halfway through that wagon ride." He looked up at her then. In the lamplight, the gray of his eyes was softer than it had been on the porch. Still careful, still watchful, but something else underneath it now. Something that hadn't decided yet what it was, but was aware of itself. "You're nothing like that letter," he said, simply, like it was something he'd observed and was reporting. "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded once, looked back at his plate, finished his supper. She did the same. The ranch hands had their opinions, and they didn't bother hiding them. Pete, the foreman, a thick-armed man in his mid-40s who had worked this land for 12 years and considered himself the last word on most subjects, made his assessment known on her second morning. She was in the yard hanging the backed-up washing she'd found piled in the laundry room. Weeks of sheets and work clothes that had apparently been accumulating since Mrs. Dole left. When Pete came around the corner of the barn and stopped short at the sight of her, he looked her over. The full inventory, slow and deliberate, the kind of look designed to remind a person they're being assessed. "You're the new woman," he said. "That's right," she said. She kept pinning sheets. "Where'd you come from?" "South, town called Hale Creek." He crossed his arms, leaned against the barn. "What made you come all the way up here? Woman like you." She glanced at him. "Same thing that makes anyone go somewhere. An opportunity." He snorted. Not hostile exactly, but weighted. The sound of a man who has already decided the punchline. "Ranch work ain't what you're used to, I expect." "Probably not," she said, reaching for the next sheet. "Most things worth doing aren't what you're used to. That's rather the point." The snort died. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at her with something that was not quite respect yet, but was in the neighborhood of recalibration. A man updating a prior assumption, reluctantly, because the data didn't support it. He said nothing further. He walked on. Jimmy, passing her an hour later on his way to the barn, touched his hat brim and said, "Morning, ma'am," with such genuine warmth that she thanked him and meant every word. He grinned and kept walking, and she thought, that one's all right. Caro, the quiet Mexican hand, whose English was careful and selective, said nothing to her directly for the first 3 days, but she caught him watching her twice when she was working in the yard. Not unfriendly, assessing. On the 4th day, she stopped near where he was repairing a fence and said, with gestures to fill what vocabulary couldn't, "The east pasture, the water. Is it usually that color?" Caro looked at her for a moment. "No, senora," he said. "Not usually." "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of a man who takes things seriously. She walked on. Wes, the teenager, 17 at most, all nerves and bravado in equal measure, knocked over a bucket the first time she appeared unexpectedly in the kitchen doorway. The second time, a stack of tin cups. The third time she took to making deliberate noise coming down the hallway. After that he managed not to drop anything, though he turned red every time she said good morning. So, she went into the supply room on the 5th day and didn't come out for 3. It was worse than she'd imagined, and better than she'd feared. Everything that had ever needed storing and hadn't had an obvious home had ended up in that room. Tack equipment mixed with dry goods, wooden crates stacked 3 high with no record of their contents, a rusted coffee grinder that had been placed carefully on a shelf as though someone intended to come back for it and then never did. 2 saddles in need of repair buried under canvas tarps. Rope. Lamp oil canisters, some empty, some not, stored together without differentiation. She made a list first. Then she started moving things. On the 2nd day, behind a stack of equipment crates against the north wall, she found them. 12 jars of preserved vegetables and 4 of fruit, put up the previous summer, still sealed, still good. And behind those, a full crate of canned goods, tins of beans and tomatoes and salt pork, that had been buried so completely that no one had known they existed. She stood there looking at them for a long moment. Then she went to find Caleb. He was at the corral, watching a young horse that Pete was working. She came across the yard toward him, and he turned when he heard her, reading something in her face before she spoke. "You need to come see something," she said. He followed her to the supply room without asking questions. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she'd done. The cleared floor, the labeled shelves, the organized sections, everything sorted and assessed and put where it made sense to put it. Then he looked at the crate she'd moved to the center of the room and opened. He crouched down, looked at the tins, looked at the jars. He was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Dole always said the inventory felt off," he said finally. His voice was low. He was doing math in his head. She could see it. "I thought she meant she was losing track. I didn't think—" "It was buried," Abigail said. "It wasn't lost. It was just buried." He looked up at her from where he was crouching. "How long did this take you?" "Most of 3 days." He stood up. He looked at the room again. Then he looked at her directly. "What else have you seen?" She had been waiting for that question. Not impatiently. She would have told him regardless. But she had been waiting for it because the asking of it mattered. "The barn roof," she said. "Northwest corner. There's a gap. Not large, but it'll let water in when the snow comes. Needs attention before fall." She watched him. "The bunkhouse stove is drafting badly. Pete mentioned it in passing, and I think he's been putting off bringing it to you. And the eastern trough. Jimmy and Caro found it yesterday," he said. "Dead deer in the creek, 2 miles upstream. Contaminated the whole eastern tributary." His jaw was tight. "We rerouted the water line this morning." "How many head in the east pasture?" she asked. 43. She did the calculation. He watched her do it. "If it had gone another week," she said. "Yes," he said. "At current prices?" "Yes," he said again. Quieter. She stopped. Let the silence hold what they both understood. You've been here less than a week, Caleb said. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a man's face when he was looking at her. No inventory. No assessment of what she was worth to him in the narrow terms men usually applied to women. Something wider than that. Something that was taking in all of her. The things she'd noticed, the trough she'd mentioned at supper, the supply room she'd reorganized, the list she was still holding in her hand, and arriving at a conclusion she couldn't yet read. I pay attention, she said. I always have. Your father's letter, he said. I know. He called you ordinary. I know. He was wrong. She looked at him. The words landed differently than she expected. Not like balm, not like the relief of finally being seen, though there was some of that. They landed like something solid, like ground under her feet where she had not been certain there was any. Thank you, she said, simply. Without deflecting it or diminishing it the way she'd been trained to do, he nodded once. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a shelf, turned it in his hands once. Supper at 6, he said. I know, she said. He walked out. She stood in the middle of the reorganized supply room, alone, listening to his footsteps cross the yard. She thought about the word ordinary. She thought about the 26 years she'd spent being told that word applied to her. She thought about this man, this quiet, serious, careful man, looking at a crate of recovered goods and a reorganized room and saying, flatly and without performance, he was wrong. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where the truth of you could be seen. She picked up her list. She went back to the kitchen. She had supper to start. That night, after the dishes were done and Caleb had gone out to do the last check of the horses, she sat at the kitchen table with her mother's recipe book open in front of her. She wasn't reading it. She was just looking at it. At the handwriting she'd memorized 20 years ago. At the small notations in the margins. More salt, less time. Jay likes this one. The private language of a woman who had cooked with intention and recorded what she learned. She would have liked it here, Abigail thought. The thought surprised her. She hadn't thought about her mother in connection with something positive in a long time. Mostly she thought about her mother the way you think about something taken too soon, with an ache and a closed door. But sitting here in this kitchen, in this plain, serious, honest house at the edge of the Montana Territory, she thought, she would have liked the size of the sky. She heard Caleb's footsteps on the porch. The door opened. He came in, hat in hand, and stopped when he saw her at the table. You're still up, he said. Thinking, she said. He hung his hat. He moved to the stove and poured himself the last of the coffee without asking. She'd noticed he always left it going until the last check, and stood leaning against the kitchen counter. What are you thinking about? He asked. She looked down at the recipe book. My mother. I was quiet. She felt him deciding whether to speak. She passed, he said finally. When I was 14. I'm sorry. She was the kind of person, Abigail said slowly, who made every room feel like somewhere you wanted to be. She ran her thumb along the edge of the recipe book. I've been trying to figure out how she did that. I think it was just, she paid attention to people. She noticed what they needed before they said it. She looked up. I think I got that from her. The noticing. Caleb was looking at her with that careful, open attention. It's a valuable thing, he said. My father didn't think so. Your father, Caleb said, setting his coffee cup down, is a man who apparently can't see past the end of his own ledger book. His voice was even, matter of fact. What a man like that misses. He stopped himself, shook his head once. It's his loss. She looked at him. He looked back. Between them, in the lamplight, in the kitchen that smelled like good food and strong coffee, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to working places at rest. Something was present that neither of them had named, and neither of them was reaching for. Not yet. Too soon for that. Too new. But it was there. She felt it the way you feel weather coming, not from seeing it, but from something changing in the air around you. The quality of light, The way sound carries. Something that says, things are shifting. She closed the recipe book. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." She took the lamp and went upstairs. In the east-facing room, she set the lamp on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment, looking at nothing. She had arrived 5 days ago as her father's problem. The thing to be arranged away. The daughter nobody wanted. The woman that letter had described in terms that were supposed to settle the question of her worth permanently. 5 days. And this man, this quiet, careful, serious man, had looked at the evidence of who she actually was and said, without drama, without performing it, he was wrong. She did not let herself run ahead of that. She had 26 years of practice at not running ahead of things. She knew what hope that moved too fast could cost you. But she lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and she listened to the Montana night coming in through the open window, the creak in the distance, the horses shifting in the paddock, the slow meditative turn of the windmill, and she let herself feel it. Not hope exactly, something steadier than hope, something that felt, for the first time in her life, like the beginning of being known. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep without dread. The morning after the supply room discovery, Pete showed up at the kitchen door before breakfast. He didn't knock. He stood in the open doorway with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and he looked at Abigail the way a man looks at something that has rearranged itself without his permission. "Heard you found the Dole stores," he said. "I did," she said. She was at the stove, not looking at him. "Been looking for those tins since February." "They were behind the equipment crates on the north wall," she said. "Under 2 canvas tarps." A pause. "I looked in that room." "You looked at the room," she said. "There's a difference." Howe was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something. Then he said, with the particular stiffness of a man who is not accustomed to reconsidering, "The boss want anything special for the hands this week?" She turned and looked at him directly. "What do the hands need that they haven't been getting?" He blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd expected. "Coffee's been thin," he said, after a beat. "I found 3 pounds of good ground coffee in the back of the pantry," she said. "Tell them it'll be strong starting tomorrow morning." He looked at her for another moment, nodded once, walked away. She turned back to the stove. That was how it started with Pete. Not with warmth, not with any sudden conversion, but with the slow and grudging recalibration of a man who respects results, and had just been presented with one he couldn't argue with. She understood men like Pete. She'd grown up around them in her father's store. Men who had decided the world worked a certain way and experienced any evidence to the contrary as a personal affront. The only language they trusted was the language of what actually happened. She intended to keep giving Pete things that actually happened. It was Jimmy who told her about Everett Caldwell. She hadn't asked. She'd learned early that the best information came when you weren't asking for it, when you were doing something ordinary and the other person forgot to be careful. She was mending a torn work shirt at the kitchen table 3 days after the supply room, and Jimmy had come in for a cup of water, and he stood at the kitchen window drinking it and looking out at the north pasture with the unfocused expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. "Something wrong out there?" she asked, without looking up from the mending. "Nothing wrong," he said. Then, almost immediately, "Saw a rider on the ridge this morning, north boundary." Her needle paused. "Someone you know?" "Caldwell's man," Jimmy said. He said it the way you say a thing you've said too many times before, not with fresh alarm, but with a weariness that means the alarm has been there so long it's just become part of the landscape. 3rd time this month. She set the shirt down in her lap. "Who's Caldwell?" Jimmy turned from the window and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just remembered that she is new and does not know the geography of this particular trouble. "Everett Caldwell," he said. "Owns the big spread southeast of here, maybe 3 times the size of this one." He paused. Chose his words with the care of a loyal man who doesn't want to be caught speaking out of turn. "He's been wanting to buy this land for a long time. And Mr. Whitaker won't sell." "No, ma'am." "Why does Caldwell want it so badly?" Jimmy was quiet for the moment. He looked back out the window. "Water rights," he said finally. "That creek that runs through the north pasture. It's the main clean water source for about 30 miles in any direction. Whoever controls that water controls what everybody else can do out here." He set his cup down. Caldwell already bought out 2 ranches east of his. Both of them sold inside of a year after he started pushing. "How does he push?" Jimmy's jaw moved like he was chewing on whether to answer. "Jimmy," she said quietly, "I'm not asking to gossip. I'm asking because I'm here now, and I'd rather know what I'm in the middle of." He looked at her, seemed to decide something. "Rumors mostly," he said. "Stories that get around town. That a ranch is struggling, that the owner's losing his grip, that the operation's not what it used to be. Once the reputation starts going, the credit dries up, the buyers stop coming, the hands start looking elsewhere." He picked his hat up from the table. "Caleb's been fighting it for 2 years. Hasn't sold an inch." A pause at the door. "He won't. But Caldwell ain't the kind of man who stops just because the answer is no." He went out. Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the mended shirt in her hands and thought about everything Jimmy hadn't said as much as everything he had. A man who used rumors as weapons. A ranch that was fighting for its reputation. A water source that made this land worth more than it appeared. She thought about her father. About Silas Hartwell, who had built his entire career on the careful management of other people's perceptions. She knew that world. She understood the mechanism of it better than most people would guess, because she'd been the target of it her whole life. She picked up the shirt and finished the mending. But her mind was moving in a different direction now. She brought it up at supper that evening. They had fallen into a rhythm by now, 6 days in, that felt more natural than it had any right to feel this quickly. Caleb came in at 6, hung his hat, sat down. She brought food. They ate. They talked, more than she'd expected. Not about large things, not yet, but about the ranch, about the work, about the small problems that needed solving, and what solving them would require. It was conversation that had the texture of partnership, and she was careful not to look at it too directly because she didn't yet trust her own interpretation of it. "Jimmy told me about Caldwell," she said, after they'd been eating for a few minutes. Caleb's spoon stopped. "He told you about Caldwell," he said. "He mentioned a rider on the North Ridge. I asked." Caleb set his spoon down. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was not quite guarded, but had something careful moving behind it. "What did he tell you?" "Water rights, reputation, 2 years of pressure." She met his eyes. "That Caldwell doesn't take no for an answer." He was quiet for a moment. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said. "I didn't say you couldn't." She held his gaze. "I said I wanted to know. There's a difference." He looked at her across the table. Something tightened in his jaw and then released. "He's made 3 offers in 2 years, Caleb said. Each one higher than the last. I've turned all 3 down." His voice was flat and steady. "The land belonged to my father, and to his father before him. That water." He stopped, started again. "If Caldwell gets this water, every small operation within 30 miles is at his mercy. Not just me. Every family that runs cattle or crops or keeps horses out here. He controls the water. He controls all of it." A pause. "I won't sell." "What does he do when someone won't sell?" Caleb's eyes met hers directly. "He finds another way," she nodded, slowly. "The rumors." "Started about 18 months ago," he said. "Stories that the ranch was failing, that I'd been making poor decisions, that I was—" He stopped again. His jaw moved. "That losing my wife broke something in me, that I wasn't the man my father was." The words landed in the room and stayed there. She looked at him carefully. Not with pity. She already knew he would close off entirely at pity. With the tension. The kind of attention that says, "I am taking this seriously because you are serious." "Were any of the rumors true?" she asked. He looked at her sharply. "No," she said. "I'm not asking to wound you. I'm asking because I want to understand what's real and what he manufactured. If I'm going to be useful to you—" She stopped. chose more carefully. If I'm going to be here, I want to know the actual shape of things. He held her gaze for a long time. Some of it, he said finally. After Sarah died, after my wife. He looked at the table. 2 years. There were 2 years where I kept the operation running, but I wasn't. I wasn't ahead of anything. I was just keeping up. Falling behind in places I didn't even notice until it was already done. He looked up again. Caldwell saw it. He's a man who watches for weakness, like a hawk watches for movement in the grass. He saw the 2 years, and he's been using them ever since. And now? She asked. Something shifted in his face. Now I'm ahead again. His eyes moved briefly, almost involuntarily, to the direction of the kitchen doorway, toward the supply room beyond. Or I'm getting there. She understood what that meant. She did not make a production of it. He'll try something else, she said, when the rumors don't work. He always does. Then we should know what we're dealing with before it comes. She picked up her fork. I'd like to look at your ranch records, the financial ones, land documents, whatever you have going back 5 years. Caleb stared at her. Why? He said, not defensive, genuinely wanting to understand. Because men who operate the way Caldwell operates, she said evenly, don't just use rumors. Rumors soften the ground. Then they use something harder, something that looks official, something on paper. She met his eyes. My father ran a business for 30 years. I grew up watching how men with money and ambition operate when they want something, and someone is blocking them. She set her fork down. I know what that playbook looks like, Mr. Whitaker, and I'd like to know if there's anything in your records that could be used against you before he finds it first. The silence that followed was the longest they'd had at this table. Caleb looked at her across the candlelight, and she watched him working through something. The instinct to say, I manage my own affairs, against whatever it was he'd seen in her this past week, that was making him reconsider what help could look like when it came from the right direction. After supper, he said finally, I'll get the ledgers. He brought them out to the kitchen table while she washed the dishes. 3 leather-bound ledgers, worn at the corners, and a wooden box of documents, land filings, and correspondence tied in separate bundles with cord. She dried her hands. She sat down across from the ledgers. She opened the first one. Within 10 minutes, she understood that the ranch was financially sound. Caleb was not a careless man with numbers. The records were detailed, consistent, maintained with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the paperwork was as much a part of ranching as the cattle. Income from cattle sales, expenses broken down by category, wages, supplies, repairs. It was all there. What she was looking for was something different. She went through the land documents next. The original deed, filed by Caleb's father in 1851. A boundary survey from 1863. Several smaller documents about water rights and access easements. She stopped. When was this drawn up? She said, pulling out a single sheet. Caleb leaned across the table to look. What is it? This easement. She laid it flat. This document gives a grazing access right to a property listed as the Caldwell Southern Parcel. It's dated 1869. She looked up. Did you agree to this? Caleb's brow drew down. He pulled the document toward him and read it. His face went very still. No, he said, quietly, flatly, like a word that has been compressed to its smallest possible form. Did your father? My father died in 1868. His voice was the same quality of quiet, the quiet of a man who is very carefully not reacting until he understands what he's reacting to. This is dated a year after he died. She looked at him. He looked at the document. That's not his signature, he said. She looked at the signature at the bottom. Then she looked at the signature on the original deed from 1851. Even without being an expert, even without a trained eye, the difference was there if you looked for it. The original had the particular quirks of an individual hand, the slight backward lean on the capital letters, the way the H crossed itself. The 1869 signature had the same general shape, but without those idiosyncrasies. like someone had copied from a sample without understanding the original's organic habits. "It's close," she said. "It's not his," Caleb said. "No," she agreed. He stood up abruptly and moved to the window. He stood there with his back to her, both hands on the sill, his shoulders up and rigid. She gave him a moment. She knew better than to push into a man's anger when it was this fresh and this justified. "How long has that been in there?" he said, without turning around. "I don't know," she said. "It was between the 1863 survey and the deed renewal paperwork. Could have been placed there any time in the last several years, if no one was looking for it specifically." "No one was looking for it," he said. "Why would I look for something I didn't know existed?" "You wouldn't," she said. "That's exactly why it was put there." He turned around. His face was controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something. "What does it mean, legally? What can he do with it?" She thought carefully before she answered. "I don't know the territory law well enough to say exactly. But an easement like this, if it was accepted as valid, could give him a claim to part of the water access. It could be used to challenge your rights in court. It could be used to complicate a land dispute or a debt claim." She held his gaze. "It's not a weapon by itself. It's a lever. Something he could use to force a situation where you'd have to fight him in court or settle outside of it." "He manufactured evidence," Caleb said. Flat, cold, like a verdict. "It looks that way," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. His jaw was hard. His hands were still. "I need to take that to someone who knows the law," he said. "Yes," she said. "Someone you trust. Not in town if Caldwell has influence there." He looked at her sharply. "How do you know he has influence in town?" "I don't know it," she said. "But a man who operates the way you've described him, patient, systematic, willing to wait 2 years, doesn't stop at rumors and forged documents. He builds relationships. He puts himself in rooms where decisions get made." She paused. "Your father's letter said I wasn't suited to society. What it missed was that I spent 26 years watching how society actually works when there's something at stake." He looked at her for a very long time. Something was happening in his face that she couldn't fully interpret. It was too layered, too private. But the anger was being joined by something else. Something that looked like the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that he's forgotten you can put it down. "There's a judge in Billings," he said slowly. "Judge Abner Colt. He knew my father. He's straight." He looked at the document still lying on the table. "I'll ride to Billings. Send word first," she said. "Don't ride in without knowing he's there and willing to see you. If Caldwell has eyes anywhere, and he will, you walking into a judge's office unannounced gives him time to move first." Caleb stared at her. "Your father was a merchant," he said. "Yes." "And you learned all this from watching him." "I learned what not to do from watching him," she said, "and what the people who outmaneuvered him did instead." He pulled out a chair and sat back down at the table. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the document. He looked at her. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Yes?" "I owe you an apology." She blinked. "For what?" "For thinking," he said slowly, "that what you were coming here to do was cook and mend." He held her gaze steadily. "I should have read that letter from your father and known, right then, that a man who describes a woman the way he described you is not describing her. He's describing his own failure to see her." The words landed somewhere so deep she felt them before she could think about them. She did not look away. She did not deflect. "Thank you," she said, for the second time, with the same simplicity. He nodded. He reached out and carefully, deliberately, moved the forged easement document to the side, apart from the others, isolated. Evidence. Treated accordingly. "We keep this between us for now," he said. "Not even Pete." "Agreed," she said. "I'll get word to Colt." "All right." He started to gather the other ledgers, and then stopped. He was looking at something in the correspondence bundle, a letter, folded differently from the others, the paper slightly newer. He pulled it out. His face changed. She watched the change happen and felt the temperature in the room drop 2 degrees. "What is it?" she asked. He handed it to her without a word. It was a letter, addressed to Caleb, dated 6 weeks ago, written in the careful, formal hand of a man who had hired a lawyer to phrase his threats as courtesies. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, I write again, in the spirit of neighborly goodwill, to express my continued interest in the property you hold at the northern boundary. It has come to my attention that the operation has faced certain difficulties in recent seasons, and I want you to know that my offer remains open and generous. Should you find yourself in a position where resolution becomes necessary, I trust you know where to find me. I have always believed that reasonable men can arrive at reasonable agreements. Your neighbor and friend, Everett Caldwell." She read it twice. Then she set it down. "Reasonable men," she said. "That's what he calls himself," Caleb said. "This letter was written 6 weeks ago," she said, "before I arrived, before anyone outside this ranch knew what was here." She looked up. "He knew about the difficult seasons. He knew you were struggling. Everyone in the county knew," Caleb said. His voice was tight. "That was the point of the rumors. He starts them. They spread. Then he writes a letter like this one using the rumors he created as evidence that your situation is desperate. And the forged document is the next step," she said. "After the letter. Something that makes a court case possible if you don't agree to sell." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't filed anything yet," she said. "If he had, you'd have received something official, which means he's still in the pressure stage. He wants you to come to him." "I'm not going to him." "I know." She looked at the letter one more time. "But we need to move before he does. If Judge Colt sees the forged easement before Caldwell can present his version of it, he loses the weapon," Caleb said. "He loses this one," she said carefully. "Men like Caldwell don't have just one." He looked at her with that expression again. The one she was starting to recognize. The one that meant he was updating something in how he understood the situation. "What do you think he has left?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I'd like to keep looking at these records." He pushed the entire box toward her. "Look at all of it," he said. She looked at all of it. Over the next 4 evenings, after the ranch had gone quiet and the lamp burned low on the kitchen table, she went through every document in that box, every land filing, every contract, every receipt and bill of sale and correspondence. She made notes on a separate sheet of paper, things that needed verification, things that looked irregular, things that were fine but would need to be clearly established if there was ever a legal challenge. Caleb sat with her on 2 of those evenings, not always reading, sometimes just present, drinking coffee, occasionally answering questions. On the second evening, Pete knocked on the kitchen door at 9 o'clock, looking for Caleb about something with the night horses, and he stopped short when he saw the 2 of them at the table surrounded by papers and ledgers. He looked at the papers. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Caleb. "Everything all right?" he said slowly. "Fine," Caleb said. "What's the problem with the horses?" Pete answered, something about the black mare being restless, probably the coyotes closer than usual. But his eyes went back to Abigail once more before he left. She could feel him recalculating again, not with hostility now, with something more complicated. A man who is beginning to understand that the person he dismissed on the second day is considerably more than he assumed, and is not entirely sure how to hold that information. She said nothing about it. She went back to the documents. The twist came on the 4th evening. She almost missed it. It was in a supply contract, a routine agreement for cattle feed and grain, dated 14 months ago, between Caleb and a merchant named Orrin Lyle in town. She almost set it aside. It looked ordinary. It looked like 100 other contracts in the box. Then she read the payment clause. She read it again. She set it down, picked it up, read it a 3rd time. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He looked up from the ledger he'd been cross-referencing. She slid the contract across the table without a word. He picked it up. "Read it." She watched his face. "I signed this," he said. "I know," she said. "Read the payment clause again, specifically the penalty section." He read it. She watched the moment he found it, the slight tensing around his eyes, the stillness that spread through him from the center outward. "This clause," he said, very quietly. "This says that if the outstanding balance isn't cleared by the 1st of October, the merchant has the right to pursue the debt through any legal means available, including—" He stopped. "Including assignment of debt to a third party," she said. "Read who the assigned party is." He looked at the bottom of the clause. A name listed as the authorized third-party recipient of any assigned debt from Orrin Lyle's business accounts. Everett Caldwell. The name sat there on the paper, like something that had been waiting to be found. Caleb set this contract down. He placed both hands flat on the table. He stared at it. "Lyle is his man," Caleb said. "Lyle has been bought," she said. "Either way, the debt on this contract—" $340, Caleb said. "I know. I've been paying it down. I owe—" He calculated. "About $80 remaining." "Due by the 1st of October, she said, "which is 7 weeks from now." He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there again the way he'd stood when she showed him the forged easement. Back to her, hands on the sill. But this time the tension in his shoulders was different. Before, it had been the shock of discovering a threat. Now it was the recognition of a pattern, the moment when separate pieces suddenly reveal themselves as a single design. "He's been building this for years," Caleb said. His voice was controlled, barely. "The rumors, the forged easement, getting his hooks into Lyle. All of it pointed at this. At a moment where I'm legally vulnerable enough that he can use a court order to force a sale." He turned around. "If he can get a judge to accept the easement and the debt assignment simultaneously, he makes a case that the land is already partially encumbered," she said. "He drives the value down, he drives your options down, and then he makes an offer that suddenly looks like the only way out." "He wants me to have no choices left," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "Except you found it before October." He looked at her. "We found it," he said. She held his gaze. "You need to clear that debt before it can be assigned. Clear it completely, before the 1st of October, and the transfer clause dies. Caldwell loses the mechanism." $80, he said. "In 7 weeks. That's manageable." He was already moving, thinking ahead, the way a practical man thinks when a problem has resolved itself from threat to task. "We've got a cattle sale scheduled for next month. I can move some of it earlier. And the easement goes to Judge Colt," she said. "Week after next," he said. "I've already sent word." She nodded. She looked at the contract still lying on the table between them. This piece of paper that had been sitting in a wooden box, completely ordinary looking, waiting for the right moment to become a trap. "Miss Hartwell," Caleb said. She looked up. I was looking at her with the full weight of everything they had found in the last 4 evenings on his face. The forged signature, the debt clause, the name at the bottom of a payment clause that tied a seemingly ordinary merchant contract to the man who had been systematically trying to destroy this ranch. "If you hadn't looked at these records," he said, "if you hadn't asked to see them." He stopped, shook his head once. "You would have found it eventually," she said. "October 1st, he said. Would have found it October 2nd. She felt the weight of that. She let herself feel it without minimizing it. "I grew up watching my father lose to men like Caldwell," she said quietly. "Men who were patient and systematic and built their traps from the inside out where nobody thought to look." She looked down at the contract. He lost because he never thought someone was playing a longer game than he was. She looked back up at Caleb. "I'm not willing to watch that happen again." Something crossed his face. So fast, she almost missed it. Something that was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. Something deeper and more private that he brought back under control almost immediately. "Neither am I," he said. He picked up the contract. He placed it with the forged easement document, the separate pile, the evidence pile. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've been at this table until midnight 4 nights running." "So have you," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Go to sleep, Miss Hartwell." She gathered her notes. She folded them carefully and tucked them inside her mother's recipe book, which she'd started bringing to the table because it was the one thing in the house that felt entirely hers. She took the lamp and went toward the stairs. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped, turned. He was still standing at the table, both hands resting on the surface, looking at her. "I'm glad you're here," he said. 3 words, plain and direct and without decoration. Said the way he said everything, because he meant it and not for any other reason. She looked at him across the lamplight. "So am I," she said. She went upstairs. She did not immediately go to sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held the recipe book and thought about what it meant. This specific thing, this moment, this man in this house who had handed her a box of documents and said, "Look at all of it," and had meant it. She thought about Everett Caldwell somewhere south of here, patient and confident, and certain that his trap was set and his timeline was running. She thought about a forged signature and a debt clause and a name at the bottom of a payment contract. She thought about 7 weeks. She set the recipe book on the nightstand. She lay down in the dark. Outside the window, the Montana night was enormous and quiet and full of stars she was only beginning to learn the names of. He doesn't know, she thought. Caldwell doesn't know what changed. He had built this entire design around a solitary, grieving rancher who had no one in his corner. Around a man alone. Around a vulnerability that no longer existed. She closed her eyes. He has no idea what walked through that door. The cattle sale happened on a Thursday. Caleb had moved it 3 weeks earlier than planned, quietly, without explanation to anyone outside the kitchen table. He told Pete it was a timing decision. Prices were better early in the season, which was true enough to hold. Pete accepted it without question, because Pete trusted Caleb's judgment on cattle the way he trusted the sun to come up, and because the decision made financial sense on its face, even without the reason underneath it. What Pete didn't know was that by Friday morning, the outstanding balance on the Lyle contract would be cleared. Completely. Every last dollar. Abigail knew. She'd been the one who calculated exactly how many head needed to move to cover the debt with enough margin that there would be no question of the payoff. No rounding, no approximation. Nothing Caldwell could later argue was technically incomplete. She'd gone through the ledgers twice to make sure. Caleb rode out before dawn on Thursday with Jimmy and Caro to bring the cattle to market. She stayed at the ranch. She had her own work to do. She had been thinking about Orrin Lyle for 2 weeks. The merchant who had either willingly or under pressure tied his debt accounts to Everett Caldwell's name. She had turned the question over carefully, the way she turned all difficult things. What did she actually know? What was she assuming? And what was the difference between the two? What she knew, the contract existed, the clause was real, Caldwell's name was on it. What she didn't know, whether Lyle understood what that clause was being used for, or whether he was simply a man who had taken money in exchange for a piece of paper and told himself it was someone else's business what happened next. That distinction mattered. Not because it changed what Caldwell had done, but because it changed what Lyle might be willing to do now, if given the chance. She asked Wes to hitch the small wagon. He blinked at her. "You going to town, ma'am?" "I am," she said. "Does Mr. Whitaker know?" "Mr. Whitaker knows I am capable of making decisions," she said pleasantly. "Hitch the wagon, Wes." He hitched the wagon. She drove herself to town. Hales Crossing was the kind of town that knew everything about everyone and had opinions about all of it. She had been there twice since arriving. Once with Caleb to collect supplies. Once with Jimmy for feed. And both times, she had felt the particular texture of a place where her presence was noted, assessed, and filed away in the collective memory of people who didn't have enough happening to occupy their attention fully. She was aware, walking into Lyle's Mercantile that Thursday morning, that she was being watched. She didn't care. Orrin Lyle was a thin man in his 50s, with the careful, apologetic manner of someone who had spent decades trying not to be the source of anyone's displeasure. He was behind his counter when she came in, and he looked up with the polite readiness of a shopkeeper. And then recognition crossed his face. She was the Whitaker woman, the one who'd arrived in July. Everyone had an opinion, and the readiness became something more guarded. "Ma'am," he said. What can I do for you? She placed the supply contract on his counter. She had brought a copy. The original was with the evidence bundle, locked in the box under Caleb's desk. She spread it flat and turned it so Lyle could read it right side up, and she pointed to the payment clause. I'd like to talk about this, she said. Lyle looked at the contract. His face went through several things in quick succession. Recognition, discomfort, and then a careful neutral blankness that she recognized as the expression of a man who had decided not to react until he understood what was happening. That's a standard supply contract, he said. Most of it is, she said. The payment penalty clause isn't. He said nothing. Mr. Lyle, she said, keeping her voice even and not unkind. I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm going to tell you something straightforwardly, and I'd like you to hear all of it before you decide what to say. He looked at her, nodded, barely. The outstanding balance on this contract will be cleared in full by tomorrow morning, she said. Which means the assignment clause becomes moot regardless. Mr. Caldwell will not be able to use it. She let that land. What I want is whether you understood, when you signed the version of this contract that included that clause, what it was going to be used for. Lyle's jaw moved. Caldwell came to you, she said. Not a question. Lyle looked at the counter. He's a significant customer, he said quietly. A man like that, when he asks for something. When he asks for something, she said. You find it hard to say no. I understand that. She did. She understood it the way someone understands a thing they've seen operate from both sides. Did he tell you he intended to use the debt to force a land sale? A long pause. He said it was a business arrangement, Lyle said. His voice had gotten quieter. That it would be handled between the two of them. That it was none of my... He stopped. He told you it was none of your concern, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about anger. She had every right to it. This thin, apologetic man who had let himself be used as a tool against a family that had done business with him honestly. But anger wasn't what this moment needed. The debt will be cleared tomorrow, she said again. You don't owe Caldwell anything beyond whatever he's paid you for his own supplies. When he comes to you about the assignment, and he will come, you can tell him truthfully that the balance was cleared before the deadline and the clause never triggered. She folded the copy of the contract. I'm not asking you to do anything except tell the truth. Lyle was quiet for a long moment. He won't be happy, he said. No, she agreed. He won't. She picked up the contract and turned to leave. Miss Hartwell, Lyle said. She stopped. I knew Caleb's father, he said. Thomas Whitaker was a good man. Gave me my first line of credit when I opened this store. Didn't have to. Just... He paused. Did it because it was right. She turned and looked at him. His face had lost the careful blankness. What was underneath it was the expression of a man who had known for some time that he'd done something wrong and had been hoping, without real hope, that it wouldn't catch up with him. I'm sorry, he said, for the clause. She held his gaze for a moment. Tell the truth when he comes, she said. That's enough. She walked out. Caldwell came to the ranch on a Friday. She had not expected it to be so soon. She'd expected him to send a man first, to send a message, a letter, something at a distance the way a careful operator works when he's not certain of his ground. The fact that he came himself, in person, riding up to the main house in the middle of the afternoon with two men flanking him like he was already arriving to take possession. That told her something. He was not as certain as he wanted to appear. She was alone at the ranch. Caleb was in Billings, the meeting with Judge Colt, which had finally been arranged for that week. Pete and the hands were in the north pasture. Wes was at the barn. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses come into the yard. She dried her hands. She went to the front door and opened it before he reached the porch steps. Everett Caldwell was a large man, not in the way Caleb was large, which was the size of physical work accumulated over years, but in the way of a man who had used his size deliberately, who understood that walking into a room and taking up space was its own form of power. He was well dressed for a ranch call, which meant the call was a performance. Silver watch chain. Good boots. The kind of hat that costs more than it should. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. His eyes were the assessing kind, quick and thorough. She felt them move over her the way they moved over everything, as property being evaluated. "I'm looking for Caleb Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitaker isn't here," she said. "And you are?" "Abigail Hartwell. I manage the household." Something moved in his expression. A minor adjustment, a recalibration. He had not expected a woman to open that door. She could see him deciding what to do with her. "When do you expect him back?" Caldwell said. "I couldn't say," she replied pleasantly. He studied her for a moment. Then he smiled. The practiced smile of a man who uses warmth as a tool, deploying it where coldness would create resistance. "Well, Miss Hartwell," he said, "perhaps you could give him a message. Tell him Everett Caldwell came by. Tell him I'd like to have a conversation about the future of this property." He paused, letting the weight of future sit in the air between them. "At his earliest convenience." "I'll tell him," she said. "You've been here, what, a month or so?" he said conversationally, the smile staying in place. "How are you finding ranch life?" "I find it suits me," she said. "Good, good." He glanced around the yard with the proprietary ease of a man who is already imagining ownership. "It's a fine piece of land. Shame to see it struggling." "Is it struggling?" she said, mildly, like she was genuinely asking. He looked back at her. The smile didn't waver, but something behind it sharpened. "I only mean, a man alone, managing all this." "Mr. Whitaker manages it very well," she said. "The cattle sale last Thursday went better than expected. The books are in good order. I went through them myself recently." She let that sit for just a moment. "It's a very healthy operation, Mr. Caldwell. I think people who've heard otherwise may have been misinformed." The smile was still there, but it had changed character, from performance to calculation. "You went through the books," he said. "I did," she said. "Mr. Whitaker likes things in order. So do I." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort, without aggression, with the particular steadiness of someone who has nothing to hide and knows it. "Well," he said finally, "give him my message." "Of course," she said. He turned his horse. His two men followed. He rode out of the yard without looking back. She stood on the porch until they were over the ridge. Then she went inside and wrote down every word of the exchange while it was still exact in her memory. Date, time, what he said, what she said, the names of the two men who rode with him. She'd caught one of them when Wes called across the yard about the barn door, and the man had turned on reflex toward the sound of his name, Donnelly. She wrote that down too. She folded the paper and placed it with the evidence bundle. Caleb came back from Billings on Sunday. She heard the horse come into the yard at dusk, and she was on the porch when he dismounted, and she could read the news in his posture before he said a word. He moved like a man who has put something down after carrying it a long way. "Colt took it seriously," he said, coming up the steps. "Tell me," she said. They went inside. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He'd started doing this without asking, knowing she'd want one, and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Colt examined the document for about 20 minutes, he said. Didn't say anything while he read, just—" He paused. "He's a quiet man. Careful." Then he set it down and looked at me and said, "Caleb, this was signed a year after your father died." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Do you know whose hand this is?" And I said, "No, but it isn't Thomas Whitaker's." "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he remembered my father's hand. Said they'd corresponded for 15 years. Said he'd stake his reputation on the signature being wrong." He picked up his coffee. "He's opening an inquiry. Quietly for now. He doesn't want Caldwell to know the document has been examined until he has enough to move formally. But he's moving." She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. "There's more," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Colt told me Caldwell tried to file a complaint last week with the county clerk, alleged that this ranch had failed to honor a financial agreement and that he, as the assigned third party, had a claim against the property. He set his cup down. Colt saw the filing. He put a hold on it pending investigation, 24 hours after I cleared the Lyle debt. Caldwell moved the moment he knew the debt was cleared, she said. He was watching. Yes, Caleb said. He had someone watching Lyle's books. Or watching Lyle. She thought of Orrin Lyle's thin, apologetic face. He won't be happy. No, he wouldn't be. The hold means he can't move forward with the filing while the inquiry is open, she said. That's right. How long does the inquiry take? Colt wouldn't say exactly. Weeks, maybe months. But he said... Caleb paused. Something moved in his face. He said, "Whoever found that document likely saved this ranch." He looked at her directly. "I told him it was you." She was quiet. "He said he'd like to meet you," Caleb said. "When this is done." She looked at her coffee cup. She felt the particular quality of being seen. Not performed at. Now he walks into that room and people owe him something. People like him, Caleb said. The word like carried something under it. The particular bitterness of a man who has watched a corrupt person operate with social ease and knows that exposing them will cost something real. "When's the last time you went to one of those meetings?" she asked. He looked at her. "I stopped going. After Sarah. After the rumors started, He stopped. "Walking into a room where people had heard those things about you. It was easier to stay out here." "That was what he wanted," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "I know." "You need to go to the next one," she said. "Yes," he said, slowly, like a man deciding to walk into something difficult because it is necessary. "Yes, I do." She looked at him for a moment. "We both do." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." She held his gaze. 2 years ago, he saw a man alone and decided that was the vulnerability he'd exploit. Let him see something different. Something moved across Caleb's face, that private layered thing she was still learning to read, but she was reading it better every day. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Yes?" He looked at her for a long moment, like he was going to say something and then decided against it and chose something adjacent instead. "I'll be glad when you stop calling me Mr. Whitaker in your head," he said. She blinked. "I call you Mr. Whitaker out loud too," she said. "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "Caleb," she said, simply. "First time." He held very still. "Abigail," he said, quietly, like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Neither of them moved. The lamplight was the same. The kitchen was the same. The Montana night outside the window was the same. But something had named itself that had been unnamed, and the room felt different for it. "I'll clean up," she said, moving back toward the dishes. "I'll help," he said, and he did. He stood beside her at the wash basin and dried dishes while she washed them, and they talked about the town meeting, who would be there, what Caldwell might do, what the right approach was. And the conversation was practical and direct, and underneath it, running like a current under solid ground, was the thing that had been named. The town meeting was on a Tuesday. They went together. Caleb drove the wagon. She sat beside him on the bench in her better dress, her hair pinned up properly, her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness of a woman who has decided exactly what she is walking into and has prepared accordingly. She had spent the 4 days between the kitchen conversation and Tuesday doing 2 things simultaneously. One was continuing to review everything she knew about Caldwell's methods, talking to Jimmy, drawing out what he knew about the social landscape of Hales Crossing, asking careful questions about who held influence and who had reason to distrust Caldwell if they were given cause. The other was baking. She had made 3 pies, 2 dozen biscuits, and a large pot of apple butter for the meeting. Caleb had looked at the food on the kitchen table the morning of the meeting and said, "You're bringing food to a political gathering." "I'm bringing food to a community gathering," she said, "where people I've never met are going to have opinions about me formed entirely by what Everett Caldwell has been saying for 2 years. She wrapped the pies carefully. "I intend to give them a different data point." He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I should have thought of that myself." "You've been busy thinking about the legal documents," she said. "Division of labor." He had almost laughed. A real laugh. Not the closed, partial expression she'd gotten before, but something that opened fully for a second before he got it back under control. She filed it away the way she filed everything useful. The meeting hall was already half full when they arrived. She felt it the moment they walked in. The particular quality of attention that a room gives to something unexpected. Caleb walking through that door after 2 years of absence. And beside him, a woman nobody quite knew what to do with. She watched it happen across faces as they moved through the room. The recognition. That's Whitaker. The assessment. And who's that? The memory retrieving itself. Oh, the woman. The one who came in July. Silas Hartwell's daughter. The one he... She smiled at everyone she made eye contact with. Not performatively. Genuinely. She had nothing to be ashamed of, and she intended to make sure her face said so. Caldwell was already there, near the front, talking to 2 men she recognized from Jimmy's descriptions as local businessmen with money. He saw Caleb the moment they entered. She saw him see it, the brief, controlled stillness, and then the practiced ease resuming. His eyes moved to her. She met his gaze directly. She kept the same pleasant expression she'd had on the porch of the ranch house a week ago. She saw the calculation moving behind his eyes. A woman named Ruth Harden, the blacksmith's wife, according to Jimmy, a person of genuine influence in the community, was the first to approach them. She came across the room with the directness of someone who has decided that waiting is worse than acting. "Caleb Whitaker," she said. "It's been too long." She looked at Abigail with open assessment and none of Caldwell's concealed quality. "And you must be Miss Hartwell. We've heard about you." "Good things, I hope," Abigail said. Ruth's mouth curved. "Mixed things," she said honestly. "Small towns talk. But I'll tell you what I told my husband. I don't trust second-hand opinions. I prefer my own." "That's a sensible policy," Abigail said. "It is." Ruth looked at the pie in Abigail's hands. "Is that apple?" "It is." "Well then," Ruth said, and something in her expression settled into a warmer register. "Come and meet some people." It was, Abigail understood, an offering. A small and practical one. A local woman choosing to introduce her to the room, rather than leaving her to navigate it alone. She accepted it with everything she had. Caleb stayed near her for the first part of the evening, but not protectively. Side by side, not in front of her. She appreciated it more than she said. He understood, she was learning, the difference between standing with someone and standing over them. Caldwell made his move an hour in. The formal part of the meeting had begun, the county commissioner running through agenda items, when Caldwell raised his hand and asked to speak to a matter of community concern. The commissioner nodded. Caldwell stood up. He was very good at this part. The performance of reluctant civic duty. A man who hated to raise difficult things, but felt he had no choice. "I want to raise a concern about the northern water source," he said. "The creek that runs through the Whitaker property. There have been reports." He paused, letting the pause do its work. "Reports of contamination issues. Animals near the eastern tributary showing signs of illness. I want to know if the county has any plans to address water management in that corridor, given that it affects every rancher in the region." The room shifted. She felt it. The weight of collective attention moving, recalibrating. Caleb started to rise. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She shook her head slightly. "Wait." She stood up instead. "If I may," she said. The commissioner looked at her. Caldwell looked at her. The room looked at her. "I'm Abigail Hartwell," she said. "I manage the Whitaker Ranch. I'd like to address Mr. Caldwell's concern directly, since I was the one who identified the contamination issue he's referencing." A murmur moved through the room. "The contamination was identified 5 weeks ago," she said, clearly and without hurry. "A dead animal had fallen into the creek upstream. The Whitaker Ranch identified the problem, traced it to the source, and rerouted the water line within 24 hours of identification. The eastern tributary has been cleaned since. I have documentation of the corrective action if anyone would like to see it." She looked directly at Caldwell. "It was, in fact, the first thing I noticed when I arrived at the ranch. I think it's worth noting that the issue was found and fixed by the Whitaker operation, not reported as a hazard by anyone else." The murmur in the room changed texture. She could feel the distinction being made, the difference between a ranch that caused a problem and a ranch that caught and fixed one. Caldwell's expression was smooth and unchanged, but his hands, she noticed, had tightened slightly on the back of the chair in front of him. "Well, that's good to hear," he said pleasantly. "I'm glad it was addressed." "As is Mr. Whitaker," she said. "The health of the shared water source is something this ranch takes seriously, has always taken seriously." She looked at the room rather than at Caldwell now. "I'd also like to say, for anyone who might have heard otherwise, that the Whitaker Ranch is in sound financial health, well managed, and fully intends to be a contributing part of this community for a long time to come." She paused. "I went through the books myself. I'm confident in that assessment," Ruth Harden, from across the room, said. She went through the books herself. Dry, approving, like a verdict. A ripple of something moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, but the release of tension that sometimes looks like laughter's cousin. Caldwell sat down. She sat down. Caleb was looking at her. She looked straight ahead at the commissioner, who had cleared his throat and moved on to the next agenda item. Under the table, not visibly, Caleb's hand found hers. Not dramatically. Not as a performance for anyone in the room. Just the weight of his hand over hers, brief and steady, and then gone. She did not react outwardly. Inside, she felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Something large and quiet and solidly rooted, like a tree that has been growing for a long time, underground, and has finally broken the surface. After the meeting, standing in the yard outside the hall, while Caleb spoke with two ranchers who had come to greet him with a warmth that told her his absence had been noticed and his return mattered, Caldwell approached her. She had been half expecting it. Men like him didn't absorb a public setback without responding to it, even if the response was private. He came to stand beside her. Not confrontationally. Nothing Caldwell did was ever direct enough to be called confrontational. He stood at a civilized distance and looked out at the yard the way a man looks at property he's considering. "You're impressive, Miss Hartwell," he said. Quietly, so only she could hear. "I'll give you that." "Thank you," she said. "It's harder than it looks, standing up in a room like that," he said. "Most people can't do it." He paused. "Your father told me you weren't suited to society." She turned and looked at him. The words landed. She felt them land, felt the particular cold of hearing her father's private assessment quoted back to her by a man who had been using it as intelligence. Her father had talked to Caldwell. Of course he had. Silas Hartwell talked to anyone who seemed important. "You spoke to my father," she said. "We're acquainted," Caldwell said pleasantly. "He mentioned you, when I mentioned the arrangement with Caleb." "He mentioned me," she said, "to you, before I arrived." "How was very descriptive," Caldwell said. And now she could see it. What he was doing. What this moment was. He was trying to reopen a wound. Trying to remind her, quietly, privately, that she had been sent here as a burden, and that powerful men had already discussed her and reached their conclusions. He was trying to put her back in the box her father had built. She looked at him calmly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the forged easement document is currently in the possession of Judge Abner Colt in Billings. The inquiry opened 10 days ago." His face went completely still. Not the practiced smooth stillness. The other kind. The kind that happens before a person chooses their next move. "And the Lyle debt was cleared 2 weeks ago," she said. "In full. Before your filing with the county clerk, which Judge Colt has placed on hold pending the inquiry's outcome." Silence. "I went through every document in that ranch," she said. "Every contract, every filing, every correspondence. I found all of it." She held his gaze without a trace of performance. "You built that trap for a man alone. That man is not alone anymore." Caldwell looked at her. For the first time since she'd met him, The pleasantness was entirely gone. What was underneath it was not anger, not quite. It was the cold attention of a man who has just been forced to revise his understanding of a situation he believed he controlled. "You're very sure of yourself," he said. "I'm very sure of the documents," she said. "There's a difference." She turned and walked back toward Caleb. She heard Caldwell behind her, very quietly, say something to himself, not directed at her, not intended to be heard. She thought it was, "Who is she?" She kept walking. Caleb turned when she reached him. He looked at her face and read something there. She wasn't certain what. She wasn't certain what her face was doing. And the two ranchers politely excused themselves. "What happened?" he said. "Caldwell spoke to me," she said. "He knew my father. My father told him about me before I arrived. He was using it." Caleb's expression did something complicated and controlled. "Using it how?" "Trying to remind me of my place," she said. "His version of my place." His jaw hardened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him about the inquiry," she said, "and the debt clearance." He stared at her. "You told him we know?" "Yes." "He'll move now," Caleb said. "Whatever he has in reserve." "I know," she said. "I wanted him to move. A cornered man with something left to use will use it faster than he should. Whatever it is, I want it in the open where we can see it." She met Caleb's eyes. "We're ready. We have been ready." He looked at her for a long moment. The Montana evening was around them, the last light going out of the sky, the sounds of people departing the meeting hall, horses and wagons and voices carrying in the clear air. "You know what you are?" he said, quietly. Not a question exactly. She waited. "You're the thing I didn't know I needed," he said. "That's what you are." She looked at him. How was looking back at her with everything unguarded. The grief and the years alone, and the weight he'd been carrying, and the thing that had been building between them since the first evening at the kitchen table when she'd mentioned the Eastern trough over salt pork soup. All of it visible, all of it present, and none of it performing. She felt it match something in her. Something equally unguarded. Something that had been waiting, carefully and patiently, and with no certainty it would ever be answered, for a long, long time. "Let's go home," she said. He nodded. He helped her up onto the wagon bench. Not because she needed it, because he wanted to. They rode back toward the ranch in the dark, side by side, and the night was enormous around them, and somewhere to the south, Everett Caldwell was rearranging his plans. And somewhere in Billings, Judge Colt was reviewing documents. And the ranch was waiting. The barn and the bunkhouse and the east-facing bedroom window, and the kitchen table with its ledgers and its lamplight and its evidence bundle and its recipe book. All of it waiting. She sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench with the Montana dark coming down around them, and she thought, whatever he brings next, we see it together. She thought, that changes everything. Caldwell's next move came faster than either of them expected. 3 days after the town meeting, Pete came to the kitchen door before breakfast with a look on his face that Abigail had not seen before. Not the grudging recalibration she'd earned from him over the past weeks. Not the stiff professional courtesy he'd settled into, but something shaken. Something that had gotten under the armor of a man who prided himself on being unshakable. "There's a man in town," Pete said. "Showed up yesterday. Says he's a land assessor from the territorial government." Caleb looked up from his coffee. "What kind of assessment?" "Water rights audit," Pete said. "Says there have been complaints filed about improper use of the Northern Creek corridor. Says he's got authority to review the access records and make recommendations to the territorial office." He paused. "He's been talking to people, Caleb, all day yesterday. Merchants, ranchers, asking questions about this operation." Caleb set his cup down, slowly. Abigail was already thinking. "What's his name?" she asked. Pete looked at her. "Hargrove, Gerald Hargrove." "Who filed the complaints?" she asked. "He won't say. Claims the complaints are confidential during an active review." She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who already knows the answer to the question he's about to ask. "Caldwell," he said. "He moved faster than I thought," she said. "He knew we were ahead on the legal documents. He needed something new, and he needed it before the inquiry in Billings got any further. She thought quickly. A territorial assessor has different authority than a county judge. If Hargrove recommends a formal review of your water access rights, that process could take months, long enough for Caldwell to re-establish pressure. Can he do that? Pete said. Just send someone in like that? Anyone can file a complaint with the territorial office, Abigail said. Whether this man Hargrove is legitimate or... She stopped, looked at Caleb. We need to verify his credentials, today. How? Caleb said. Write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, she said. Ask for confirmation of a Gerald Hargrove and his current assignment. If he's real, they'll have a record. If he isn't... She let that sit in the air. And if he's real, but Caldwell arranged the complaint? Pete said. He was fully in the conversation now, she noticed, no longer standing at the edge of it the way he used to, evaluating from a distance. He was standing at the kitchen table, leaning on it, his hat in his hands. Somewhere over the past 3 weeks, Pete had crossed a line from toleration to investment without announcing it. Then we cooperate with the audit fully, and we make sure every document we have is in perfect order, she said. Which it is. Caleb stood up. I'll write to Helena this morning. Get it on the noon stage. I'll go to town with you, she said. I want to see this man myself. Caleb looked at her for a second. You want to see him? I want to see how he talks about this ranch when he thinks someone significant is listening, she said. A man running a manufactured audit talks differently in front of the ranch owner's representative than he does in front of a shopkeeper. I want to see which version he gives. Pete made a sound, low, somewhere between a grunt and what might, in a different man, have been a laugh. She's right, he said, to no one in particular. Like the words surprised him slightly on the way out. Caleb picked up his hat. Let's go, he said. Gerald Hargrove was set up at the hotel in Hales Crossing, a small room off the main floor that he'd arranged as a temporary office, with papers spread across the table and an air of officialdom that Abigail clocked within 30 seconds of walking through the door as being slightly too deliberate. Real officials, in her experience, were efficient with their authority. Men performing authority over-decorated it. How was a compact man in his 40s, with a neat mustache and the watchful eyes of someone who spent his time reading people's reactions to information. He looked up when Caleb came in, and she saw the prepared for this quality in his face. He'd known this visit was coming. He'd been expecting it since yesterday. Mr. Whitaker, Hargrove said. He rose, extended his hand. Caleb shook it. His eyes moved to Abigail. Miss Hartwell, she said. I manage the Whitaker Ranch records. Hargrove's eyes stayed on her one beat longer than was casual. I understand you're conducting a water rights audit, Caleb said. I'd like to see your authorization. Hargrove reached into the papers on the table and produced a document. He handed it to Caleb. Caleb read it. Then he handed it to Abigail. She read it carefully. It was official looking. The territorial seal, the correct formatting, a reference number, a signature from someone identified as Deputy Director of Territorial Land Records. She read every line twice. She noted the date, 2 weeks ago. She noted the reference number. She noted the specific language of the complaint description, which was carefully vague in the way that official-sounding things are vague when they need to cover a wide possible territory. The complaint that triggered this review, she said. Is it filed as a formal territorial complaint or as a private inquiry request? Hargrove blinked. I'm not sure I understand the distinction you're... The distinction is significant, she said pleasantly. A formal territorial complaint goes through the main office in Helena and is registered publicly. A private inquiry request can be filed by any individual and reviewed at the deputy director's discretion, without public registration. She held the authorization document up slightly. This reference number format. I'm not familiar with it as a formal complaint number. It looks more like a private inquiry code. The room was very quiet. Hargrove's expression had shifted from prepared for this to something more recalculating. I assure you the inquiry is entirely legitimate. I have no doubt you believe it is, she said. I'm asking about the nature of the filing. Is there any reason we couldn't contact the main Helena office today to confirm the registration? Hargrove said nothing for a moment. We've already written to Helena this morning, Caleb said, from beside her. His voice was level and final, the voice of a man making a statement rather than a threat. We should have a response within the week. Hargrove looked at Caleb, then at Abigail, then at the papers on his table. The inquiry is legitimate, he said again, but the certainty in the words had lost something. Then Helena will confirm it, Abigail said. In the meantime, we're fully cooperative with any review of the water access records. I'll have our complete documentation ready for your examination by tomorrow morning. Everything from the original water rights filing in 1851 through the current operational records. She paused. Including a forged easement document that was apparently inserted into our files at some point and has been submitted to Judge Abner Colt in Billings for investigation. The name landed in the room like something thrown. Hargrove's mustache moved. He looked at the table. He rearranged one of his papers without looking at what it was. I look forward to reviewing the documentation, he said. His voice had gone careful in the way of a man choosing his next steps very deliberately. Wonderful, she said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She turned and walked out. Caleb fell in beside her. They were halfway down the hotel corridor before she heard Hargrove, in the room behind them, moving quickly. The sound of papers being gathered, the scrape of a chair. He's going to send word to Caldwell, she said quietly. Before tonight, Caleb said. Yes. They were outside in the daylight and she stopped walking and turned to face him. The authorization document isn't legitimate, she said. The reference number format is wrong. My father dealt with 2 territorial inquiries in 30 years of business. I sat in on both of them, took notes, organized his response files. The coding system is different. She looked at Caleb directly. Hargrove may be a real person with real credentials, but this specific inquiry was not filed through the standard process. Caldwell either knows someone at the deputy director level who owed him a favor, or he paid for a document that looks right but isn't. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You knew that in there, he said. The moment you read it. I suspected it, she said. I wanted to see how he reacted when I asked the question. A man with a legitimate document isn't rattled by the question, he just answers it. And Hargrove was rattled. Very, she said. Caleb took his hat off, ran his hand through his hair, put it back on. It was the most unsettled she'd seen him move in weeks. Not because he was panicked, he wasn't, but because the shape of what they were dealing with was becoming clearer and larger simultaneously. And even a steady man takes a breath when he sees the full size of something. How many levels does this go? He said. I don't know, she said honestly. But I think Helena will tell us when they write back. She looked at him steadily. He's using official-looking process to slow us down and scare us. The same way he used rumors, used the debt clause, used the forged easement. All of it designed to make you feel like the ground is moving under your feet, so you'll accept whatever solid thing he offers you, which is his price for the land. He's built a whole system, Caleb said. Yes, she said. And we've been dismantling it piece by piece. She held his gaze. One more piece. He looked at her. Something in his face was doing that thing again. The thing she was learning. The private layered expression. But there was something different in it today. Something that had gotten closer to the surface. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I haven't. He stopped, looked at the street, looked back at her. When Sarah died, I made myself a kind of promise. That I wouldn't. That I'd keep the ranch going because it mattered, and it was what I knew, but that I wouldn't. Another stop. He was a man who chose words carefully, and was finding that the words for this particular thing were harder than the words for most things. I told myself I didn't deserve another chance at Caleb, she said. He went quiet. I know, she said, gently, not dismissively, the full weight of it, the grief and the 7 years of solitude, and the way he'd arranged his life around absence, like you arrange furniture around a missing thing, so at least the shape of it is honored. I know what you told yourself. He looked at her. I told myself something similar, she said. Different reasons, same result. You were keeping yourself away from something, and I was being kept away from it by other people, but we both ended up in the same place. She paused. Alone. He was very still. We're not alone anymore, she said. If you don't want to be. He looked at her for a long moment. On the street in front of the hotel in Hales Crossing, in the full light of morning, with horses passing, and somewhere down the block, a door opening and closing, and all the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business around them. I don't want to be, he said, very quietly. She nodded. They stood there for a moment, not moving, letting it be said and not rushing past it. Then she said, practically, we should get back. I have documentation to prepare for tomorrow morning. The corner of his mouth moved. We're in the middle of something significant, and you're thinking about the documents. I'm always thinking about the documents, she said. That's why we're winning. This time he did laugh. Fully, briefly, real. The second time she'd gotten a real laugh from him, and she filed it with the first one. These small, irreplaceable pieces of who he was becoming available to her slowly. Like country you travel through at the right pace to see it properly. They walked back to the wagon. Helena wrote back in 5 days. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, and Caleb brought it to the kitchen where she was making breakfast and set it on the table in front of her without a word. She dried her hands and picked it up. The Territorial Land Office confirmed that no formal complaint regarding water access rights on the Whitaker property had been filed through standard process. A private inquiry request had been submitted, but it had been filed under a procedural category that did not grant examination authority without additional approval. Approval that had not been obtained. Gerald Hargrove was listed as a licensed land assessor, but his current authorized assignments did not include the Whitaker property. The inquiry was unauthorized. She set the letter down. He sent a man with no legal authority to conduct a review, she said. To scare us, Caleb said. To slow us down and scare us, she said, and to give himself time to find another pressure point. She looked up. Where is Hargrove now? Left town 2 days ago, Caleb said. Pete heard he checked out of the hotel the morning after we came to see him. The moment we mentioned Helena, she said. Yes, she nodded slowly. This letter goes to Judge Colt, she said. Along with the authorization document Hargrove showed us, and a written account of everything he said in that room. It demonstrates a pattern. The forged easement, the unauthorized inquiry, the debt clause with Lyle. Colt needs to see the full picture. I'll ride to Billings Monday, Caleb said. I'm coming with you, she said. He looked at her. It's a full day's ride. I know. He held her gaze for a moment, then simply said, All right. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him pull out the chair and sit down at the table. The chair that had become his place and her place. The two of them at this table every morning and evening, like something that had always been true, like something that had simply been waiting for them to arrive at it. Abigail, he said. She turned. He was looking at the letter on the table, but he spoke to her. My father's land, he said. His father's before him. 3 generations on that ground. He paused. I've been fighting for it alone for 2 years. I've been so focused on not losing it that I forgot what it was supposed to be for. She looked at him. What was it supposed to be for? He looked up. A home, he said. Not just a ranch. A home for a family. He held her gaze steadily. It hasn't been that in 7 years. She didn't say anything. She waited. I'd like it to be that again, he said. If that's something you could want. Here, with me. He wasn't performing it. He wasn't making a speech. He was a plain-speaking man saying a plain-speaking thing with all the weight of what it cost him behind it. I know it's not what you were brought here for. I know your father arranged this like a business transaction, and I was a stranger, and you had no choice. I want you to know that none of that is what this is. What I'm asking. He stopped. I'm asking if you'd stay. Not because there's nowhere else to go, because you want to. She stood very still. 26 years. 3 failed courtships arranged by a man who described her as ordinary. A wagon ride north with a single trunk and a promise to herself. 5 weeks of work and discovery and evidence, and a town meeting, and a man who handed her a box of documents and said, "Look at all of it," like he already trusted her before she'd earned it, because something in him recognized something in her before either of them could name it. "Caleb," she said. "Yes. The morning I left my father's house," she said, "I made myself a promise that I would never again let another person decide my worth." She walked to the table. She sat down across from him. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything she wanted to understand completely. "This is me deciding, not my father, not the arrangement, not the fact that I have nowhere else to go, because I want you to know, I have options now. Ruth Hardin offered me work 2 days after the town meeting. 3 women in this county have asked me about the ranch records business. I have options." He held very still. "And I'm choosing this," she said. "I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing you. Because you are the first person in my life who looked at a box of documents and said, 'Look at all of it,' and meant it. Because you stood beside me at that town meeting, not in front of me. Because when Caldwell tried to use my father's words against me, the look on your face wasn't pity. It was anger. On my behalf." She paused. "Because you laugh like you mean it when you finally do. Because you dry dishes without being asked. Because you read my father's letter, and instead of believing it, you handed it to me and said we're starting from the same place." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing this because it is the first thing I have ever chosen entirely for myself. And it is you." He looked at her for a long time. "Abigail Hartwell," he said. "Yes? Will you marry me?" No ceremony. No performance. 5 words, direct and serious, and entirely him. She felt something happen in her chest. Not the tentative flutter she'd been careful to guard against. Not the cautious hope she'd rationed for so long, but something vast and solid and completely unafraid. "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached across the table and took her hand. Both hands around hers. The calloused, weathered hands of a working man, holding her like something he intended to hold carefully for a very long time. They sat like that for a moment, at the kitchen table, in the morning light, with the stove still warm and the coffee still hot, and the letter from Helena still open between them. Then she said, "Breakfast is going to burn." He didn't let go of her hand immediately. He looked at her with that full, unguarded expression, everything visible, nothing managed. "Let it," he said. She laughed, genuinely, freely, the kind of laugh she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could remember. He smiled. The full version, rare and unguarded and completely his. And then she got up and rescued the eggs anyway, because she was who she was, and he watched her do it from the table with the expression of a man who has understood, suddenly and completely, exactly how lucky he is. They rode to Billings on Monday. The meeting with Judge Colt lasted 3 hours. Abigail had prepared a complete file, organized by date, cross-referenced, with a written summary of events on the first page that Colt could read before touching a single document. She had learned, from her father's legal dealings, that judges appreciated clarity above almost everything. They saw enough chaos and partial information. Clarity was a gift. Colt read the summary first. Then he went through the documents in order. He asked 12 questions, all of them precise, none of them redundant. He made notes in a small notebook throughout. When he finished, he set everything down and looked at Abigail directly. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "you assembled this." "Yes, sir." "You identified the forged signature." "Yes, sir." "And the Lyle contract clause." "Yes, sir." "And the Hargrove authorization irregularity." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "Where did you find her?" "My father-in-law sent her," Caleb said, "trying to get rid of her." Colt made a sound, dry and brief, and with a great deal of experienced human observation compressed into it. "His loss," he said. He picked up his pen. "I'm expanding the inquiry," he said. "This goes beyond a single forged document. What you've brought me today establishes a clear pattern of deliberate manipulation, forged property records, unauthorized official procedures, debt manipulation through a third party. I'm writing to the territorial governor's office today." He looked up. "Everett Caldwell is going to have a very difficult winter." Caleb's hand found Abigail's under the table. She did not react outwardly, but she felt it. The particular quality of a moment that has been a long time arriving. The moment when a thing you have been fighting to hold becomes held. "How long?" Caleb asked. "Before there's a formal resolution." "Weeks, not months," Colt said. "When I write to the governor's office, things move. They don't like this kind of thing. Manufactured official process, forged territorial records. It makes the whole territory look corrupt." He closed his notebook. "You'll hear from me." They rode back in the late afternoon. The ride was long and easy, and they talked, sometimes about the case, and sometimes about nothing related to it at all. About the ranch, about plans for the barn roof that still needed attention before winter, about a book she'd mentioned wanting and that he'd apparently made note of without telling her, about the town meeting and Ruth Harden's dry approval, about what Pete had said 2 nights ago when she'd mentioned the possibility of expanding the kitchen garden. Pete had said, and this still surprised her every time she thought of it, "You'd need more hands to manage it, but I know a woman in town who's been looking for work since her husband passed. Good worker, knows plants." Pete, who had looked at her on the second morning like she was something to be endured. Pete, who now apparently thought about the garden and whether she had enough help with it. She mentioned this to Caleb. He was quiet for a moment. "Pete lost someone too," he said. "His wife, years before he came to work for my father. He doesn't talk about it." He looked at the road ahead. "I think he recognizes something in you. Something about managing, doing what has to be done when the ground under you is gone." She thought about that for a while. "He respected you before he respected me," she said. "He respected me for 12 years, Caleb said. "He's been watching to see if you were real for 5 weeks. A pause. "He decided you were real around the time you found the Lyle contract." "How do you know?" "Because he started calling you she instead of the woman," Caleb said. "Pete's vocabulary is his tells." She laughed, again that free, genuine laugh that kept surprising her with how available it had become. He smiled, watching the road. The letter from the territorial governor's office arrived 17 days later. She was in the supply room, reorganizing for the 3rd time, because the system she'd installed in the beginning had been good, but she'd learned the ranch well enough now to make it better. When Caleb came across the yard with an envelope in his hand and a look on his face she had not seen before, not the controlled expression, not the careful one. Something openly relieved, the look of a man who has been holding his breath for 2 years and has just been told he can stop. She came to the doorway of the supply room. He held out the letter. She read it. The territorial investigation into Everett Caldwell had been formally opened. Based on the evidence submitted by Judge Colt, preliminary findings indicated sufficient grounds to pursue charges of document fraud, improper use of territorial administrative procedures, and attempted coercion in connection with property acquisition. Caldwell's access to territorial land office processes had been suspended pending the investigation's completion. All claims against the Whitaker property, including the filed complaint currently on hold with the county clerk, were formally dismissed. She read it twice. She folded it along its creases. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with that full, unguarded expression, the one she'd been learning for 5 weeks, the one she now knew was the most honest version of his face. "It's done," he said. "This part," she said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "You did this." "We did this," she said. "Abigail." His voice was low. "I want you to hear me say it clearly. Without—" He paused. "I've been a man who doesn't say things clearly enough. Sarah used to tell me. She'd say, 'Caleb, you think things fully and say them halfway.'" The mention of his wife's name was careful and present. Not painful exactly, but real, the way the real things always are. "I don't want to do that with you." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "You saved this ranch," he said. "Not because I needed saving exactly, but because you saw what I couldn't see from the inside of it. Because you walked in with your mother's recipe book and your sewing tin and your one trunk, and you looked at this place, at everything Caldwell had been building, and you didn't flinch." He paused. "I've been alone for 7 years. I got used to it. I told myself I preferred it, that it was simpler." His jaw moved. "It isn't simpler, it's just emptier. And I didn't know how empty it was until you were standing in my kitchen telling me about a water trough on your first night." She looked at him. "The first night," she said. "The first night," he confirmed. "I knew then. I didn't say it because because I hadn't earned the right to say it yet. You'd just arrived. You didn't know me. And I had that letter from your father, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought, this woman deserves better than a man who falls for her before she's had a chance to fall for anyone." Something moved through her chest, warm and enormous, and completely unexpected, even though she should have expected it. "I didn't fall slowly," she said. "I want you to know that. I was being careful. I made myself be careful because I've spent 26 years learning what hope that moves too fast costs you." She held his gaze. "But it wasn't slow. It was from the moment you handed me that letter and said we're starting from the same place." She paused. Nobody had ever said that to me before. That we were starting from the same place. Equal. With the same information. That's not a small thing, Caleb. That's everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped forward. One step, closing the distance between the doorway and where she stood. And he took her face in his hands, careful and steady, and kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't perform itself. Quiet and real and completely unhurried, like something that had been waiting to be exactly what it was and was finally allowed to be. When he stepped back, he was still holding her face in his hands. "I want to marry you soon," he said. "Not out of haste, out of certainty." "How soon?" she said. "Before the snow comes," he said. She looked at him. "That's 6 weeks." "I know." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to understand that she had already known the answer from the first moment he asked. 6 weeks, she said. He smiled. The full version, the one she'd been collecting. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like arriving somewhere after a very long journey. This is what I was walking toward on that wagon. Not knowing it, but walking toward it. He kissed her forehead. He stepped back. "I should tell Pete," he said. "Pete already knows," she said. Caleb stared at her. "He doesn't miss much," she said. "He's been calling you the boss with a different inflection for 2 weeks." Caleb looked at the middle distance for a moment, with the expression of a man reassessing what he thought he'd been keeping private. "Caro knows too," she added. "How?" "Caro sees everything," she said. "He just doesn't comment on it." Caleb shook his head slowly. Then he said, "What about Jimmy?" "Jimmy has been grinning at me every morning for a week," she said. "I think he knew before we did." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. The real laugh, full and unguarded and warm. And she laughed with him, standing in the doorway of the supply room she had reorganized twice now, with the letter from the territorial governor's office in her hand, and the Montana late summer light coming in through the windows, and everything that had been uncertain for so long becoming, in this moment, the most certain thing she had ever known. They told Pete that evening. Pete listened to Caleb say it without expression. He looked at Abigail, he looked at Caleb, he looked back at Abigail. "About time," he said. Then he turned and walked back to the barn. Caleb looked at her. She looked at Caleb. "High praise," she said. "For Pete," he agreed. That was practically a speech. She went to find Ruth Harden the next morning. Not to announce anything. They weren't announcing yet, not until it was arranged properly. But because she had come to trust Ruth's directness in the way she trusted Pete's, for the same reason. Both of them said exactly what they thought, and the economy of it was a form of respect. Ruth opened her door and looked at Abigail's face and said, "Well, something happened." "Something happened," Abigail agreed. "Come in," Ruth said. "I'll put the coffee on." They sat in Ruth's kitchen for an hour. Abigail told her about Colt's letter and the territorial investigation, and Caldwell's formal dismissal, and the upcoming marriage. Ruth listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone who understands that the full story matters. When Abigail finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Your father sent you away," she said, "thinking he was solving a problem." "Yes," Abigail said. "And instead he—" Ruth stopped, shook her head with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know that human beings are endlessly, absurdly capable of missing what's right in front of them. What a thing to do to a person. What a thing to almost miss. She looked at Abigail directly. "You know what you are, don't you?" Abigail looked at her. "You're the kind of woman this country was built on," Ruth said. "The kind that doesn't get the credit because she's too busy doing the work." She poured more coffee into Abigail's cup without asking. About time someone saw it. Abigail wrapped both hands around the cup. She thought about her father's dining room. The pressed shirt and the gold watch chain and the way he'd said, "This is what's available," like she was a problem to be managed. She thought about Margaret in the doorway with her arms crossed. She thought about the wagon north and the enormous Montana sky opening up around her, and the feeling she'd had that she couldn't name yet. Possible, she'd called it. She'd felt possible. She felt more than possible now. She felt arrived. "Yes," she said quietly. "About time." Ruth raised her coffee cup. Abigail raised hers. They drank in the particular companionable silence of two women who understand each other without needing to perform it, in a kitchen in Hales Crossing, Montana, in the late summer of 1874, while somewhere across the territory, the machinery of justice was moving in the direction of Everett Caldwell, and somewhere north of town, a ranch was waiting with its barn and its bunkhouse, and its east-facing window and its kitchen table, with two places set, waiting to become what it had always been meant to be. A home. The wedding was on a Saturday. 6 weeks to the day from the morning Caleb had asked her in the doorway of the supply room. It was small. That had been her choice, and he'd accepted it without question, because he understood by now that when Abigail made a decision, she had thought it through completely, and the thinking was sound. She didn't want a performance. She'd watched two of her sisters have performances, the flowers and the musicians, and their father standing at the front of the church with his chest out. And she knew what performances were for. They were for the audience, not the people getting married. She wanted something real. Ruth Hardin stood beside her. Pete stood beside Caleb. Jimmy and Caro and Wes were there, cleaned up and uncomfortable in their good clothes, and genuinely happy in the way that people are happy when something they've been watching arrive finally arrives. The Reverend from Hales Crossing came out to the ranch itself. Abigail had asked for that, and Caleb had arranged it without comment, understanding that this land was the right place for the thing they were doing. The ceremony took 20 minutes. When the Reverend said the words, and Caleb said his and she said hers, she did not feel what she had always been vaguely afraid she would feel at a moment like this, the sense of performance, of being observed, of needing to look a certain way for people who were watching to judge. She felt none of that. She felt only the solid, particular weight of a true thing becoming official. Like a knot being tied that had already been holding for a long time. Caleb put the ring on her finger, a simple band, gold, that had belonged to his grandmother, and looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she'd been learning since the first week, and she looked back at him with everything she had, and the Reverend said what reverends say, and it was done. Pete shook Caleb's hand with both of his, which was the most physically demonstrative thing she had ever seen Pete do, and then he turned to her and said, with the stiff gravity of a man delivering a significant statement, "You're good for this place, Mrs. Whitaker." The name landed differently than she expected. Not like a loss of something, not like the erasure of Abigail Hartwell, the woman her father had called a burden. Like an addition, like a door opening into a larger room. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He nodded once, walked away. Ruth caught her eye from across the yard and mouthed something that looked like "told you so," which Abigail suspected referred to a conversation they'd had 3 weeks ago about whether Pete was actually capable of warmth or simply very good at suppressing it. The answer, apparently, was both. Jimmy was openly delighted. He shook Caleb's hand and then looked at Abigail and said, "Ma'am, I knew the first week." And when she said, "I know you did," he grinned like a man vindicated by history. Caro shook both their hands without words, which was the highest tribute Caro offered anyone, and the weight of it in his handshake said everything. Wes knocked over a chair during the small gathering afterward. Everyone pretended not to notice. Some things were constants. 3 weeks after the wedding, the formal notice arrived from the territorial governor's office. Everett Caldwell had been charged with document fraud and improper use of territorial administrative authority. His assets, including all property holdings acquired in the previous 3 years, were under review pending the investigation's outcome. The 2 ranches he had previously forced into sale east of his property were flagged for potential reversal of transaction. The county clerk's filing against the Whitaker property was not merely dismissed. It was stricken from record entirely, as if it had never existed. She read the notice at the kitchen table. Caleb sat across from her. He'd read it first, then handed it to her without speaking, the way he handed her things now, without ceremony, as though her reading it was simply the next logical step after his own, which was exactly how she understood partnership to work. She set it down. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he confirmed. She thought she would feel something enormous when the moment finally came. The culmination of everything they'd found and fought and documented and presented. She'd thought there would be something cinematic about it. The letter arriving and the weight lifting like a physical thing. What she actually felt was quieter than that, and better. The deep, steady satisfaction of a problem solved correctly. Not dramatically, but thoroughly. Every piece in place. Every document accounted for. Every lever Caldwell had built, dismantled methodically, and replaced with something he couldn't touch. "His land holdings are under review," she said. "The 2 ranches east of his." "Yes," Caleb said. "Those families," she said. "If the sales are reversed, they get their land back," he said, "if they want it." She thought about that, about the families who had sold under pressure they couldn't see the full shape of. About what it meant to have something returned to you that you'd believed was permanently lost. "I'd like to write to them," she said, "when the time is right. If there's anything I can tell them about the documents, about what Caldwell was doing, that might help them." "We'll write to them," Caleb said. She looked at him across the table. He said, "We," the way a person says the word when it has become their natural unit, not as a performance of togetherness, but as the simple, accurate description of how things worked now. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that for a moment, in the morning light, with the formal end of a 2-year campaign against this ranch lying on the table between them. "Your father," Caleb said then, carefully. She looked at him. "He'll hear about this eventually," Caleb said. "Caldwell's case. Your name is in the documents. Colt's report names you specifically." He held her gaze. "People talk. It'll get back to Hale Creek." She had thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the territorial letter arrived, in the particular way she thought about difficult things. Examining it from every side, testing her own reaction against the facts, trying to understand what she actually felt versus what she thought she was supposed to feel. "I know," she said. "Does that—" He paused. "How does that sit with you?" She considered the question honestly. "I spent 26 years wanting him to see me," she said. "Really see me. I wanted it so badly that I didn't notice for a long time how much energy I was spending on wanting it." She looked at the table. "I noticed on that wagon ride north, the second day. I was thinking about him and what he'd said and whether any of it was true, and then I looked up at the sky and thought, I am spending the last of my time in this man's story. And I stopped." Caleb listened. "He'll hear about it," she said. "And I don't know what he'll feel. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Maybe he'll tell Margaret that his daughter turned out to be useful after all, which will be the closest he can come to admitting he was wrong." She looked up. "And none of it, none of what he feels or says or doesn't say, changes what's true. What's true is here. This table. This ranch. You. She paused. He doesn't get to decide what this means. He gave up that right when he handed me a travel bag and told me I should be grateful. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said quietly. All right, she agreed. He squeezed her hand once. Let it go. I'm going out to look at that northwest corner of the barn roof, he said, standing, before the weather turns. It's been 3 months since I first mentioned that roof, she said. I've been busy, he said. You've been avoiding it because you don't like heights, she said. He stopped, turned and looked at her. Pete told me, she said pleasantly. He pointed at her. Pete talks too much. Pete talks exactly the right amount when the information is useful, she said. He put on his hat. He was fighting the full smile and losing. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, with enormous dignity. Mr. Whitaker, she said, with equal dignity. He walked out. She heard him cross the porch, descend the steps, call something to Pete across the yard. She heard Pete's response, short, dry, and then the sound of both of them moving toward the barn. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a moment and listened to the ranch alive around her. The ordinary sounds of a working day beginning. Horses, voices, the creak of the barn door, the windmill. All of it familiar now, all of it known. She knew this place the way she knew the recipe book on the windowsill, the way she knew the supply room she could navigate in the dark, the way she knew the east-facing window that let in the morning light. She was home. She picked up the territorial notice and carried it to the locked box under Caleb's desk, where the evidence bundle lived. She filed it behind the other documents in chronological order. The forged easement, the Lyle contract, the Hargrove authorization, the Helena confirmation, the Colt correspondence, and now this. The full record of a fight they had won. She locked the box. She went back to the kitchen and started the day. The twist came from a direction she had not anticipated. It was Ruth who told her, on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 weeks after the wedding, coming through the kitchen door with the directness of a woman delivering news she knows cannot wait. Your father is in town, Ruth said. Abigail set down the jar she was holding. Since when? She said. He arrived this morning on the eastern stage, Ruth said. He's at the hotel. He's been asking about you. The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail felt several things in quick succession. The old instinct, the one trained by 26 years of bracing for her father's assessments. Then, running immediately beneath it, something harder and more recent. The promise she'd made to herself on the wagon. The decision she'd arrived at on the second day of the ride north. She was not in his story anymore. She had not been since she looked up at that sky and chose to stop. Is he alone? She said. Came alone, Ruth said. No Margaret, no business associate, just him. Ruth looked at her carefully. You don't have to see him. I know, Abigail said. Whatever you decide. I know, Ruth. She said it warmly. She looked at the window. I need to think. Ruth nodded. She put a hand briefly on Abigail's shoulder. One firm, short press, the Ruth Harden version of an embrace, and left. Abigail stood in the kitchen and thought. She thought about what her father had come for. He hadn't written. He hadn't sent a letter asking permission, or warning her, or feeling out her reception. He had simply arrived, the way Silas Hartwell always managed his affairs, by placing himself in the situation and expecting the situation to accommodate him. It was the same logic that had arranged her marriage without consulting her, that had written a letter describing her to a stranger in terms designed to lower expectations, that had sat at breakfast with a fork in his hand and told her she should be grateful. He had heard about the case. She had known this was coming. And instead of writing, he had come, which meant, and she turned this over carefully, testing it from every angle. He wanted something from her that required him to be in the same room with her. An apology given in person carries more weight than a written one. A reconciliation has to be witnessed to be real. He wanted to be forgiven, or he wanted to be seen forgiving himself, which was not the same thing, and she needed to know which one it was before she walked into that hotel. She untied her apron. She put on her good coat. She went to find Caleb. He was at the corral, She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was what she'd come to expect from him, and would never stop appreciating. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I'm going to see him," she said. "All right." "Alone," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "All right." "I need it to be my decision," she said. "What I say to him, what I accept from him, and what I don't. I need it to come from me." "I know," he said. "I know exactly what that means." She looked at him. She thought about what he'd told her, about the promise he'd made himself after Sarah died, about the 2 years he'd spent deciding he didn't deserve another chance, about the work it had taken to set that down. "I'll be back before supper," she said. "I'll start the fire," he said. She rode into town. Silas Hartwell was in the hotel dining room when she found him, sitting at a table by the window with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. He looked older than she'd expected, not dramatically, not as if the months had aged him prematurely, but in the specific way of a man who had spent time sitting with something uncomfortable. He had the look of a person who had been having an argument with himself and was not winning. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. She put her hands on the table, folded, and looked at him directly. He looked back at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well," she said. He looked at the table. "I heard about the case. Caldwell." He paused. "I heard your name, what you found, what you did." "Yes," she said. "People are talking about it in Hale Creek," he said. "People I know. Men who do business with me." He stopped. His jaw moved the way jaws move when a person is saying something that costs them. "They talk about my daughter, the one who—" He stopped again. She waited. "I didn't know," he said, "what Caldwell was doing. That he'd spoken to me about you specifically to, that he was using information about you as—" "It doesn't matter," she said. He looked up sharply. "It does matter. What he—" "I know what he did," she said. "What I mean is that it doesn't matter to this conversation. What Caldwell used or didn't use isn't why you're here." She held his gaze steadily. "Why are you here, Papa?" The word came out of its own momentum. Not calculated, not deliberate, just present. The word she'd had for him her entire life, worn smooth by use, still shaped to fit. His face changed. "I was wrong," he said. Quietly. Plainly. Without the careful framing of a businessman managing an admission, which was the only version of this she'd expected to get if she got any version at all. Just the words. "I was wrong. About you. About what I said. What I wrote." He looked at his hands. "What I said to you at breakfast, the morning you left." She felt the words land. She let them land. She didn't soften them or harden against them. She just let them arrive. "You should be grateful someone is willing to take you," she said, quoting it back to him. He flinched. Genuinely. A small, involuntary thing. "Yes," he said. "Did you mean it when you said it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I believed it," he said finally. "That is not the same as meaning it. I think—" He paused. "I think I had told myself the story for so long that it had become true inside my own head. That you were— that the problem was you." "You," he looked up. "The problem was never you." She looked at her father. At the man who had raised her in the shadow of his own limitations, who had looked at a daughter who didn't fit the shape he needed and called the daughter the problem instead of questioning the shape. She looked at him, and she felt. Not what she had been braced to feel. Not the old wound reopening fully, but something more complicated. Something that acknowledged the wound and held it alongside the knowledge that wounded people sometimes wound others without ever understanding the full cost of what they're doing. "I know it wasn't me," she said. "I've known that for a while now, since about the second day on the wagon, actually." He looked at her. "I spent 2 days on that ride north going through everything you'd said to me over 26 years, she said, testing it against what I actually knew to be true about myself. And by the time I arrived at that ranch, I had decided, completely and without reservation, that your account of who I was would not follow me another step. He was very still. And I was right, she said. You were not describing me. You were describing your failure to see me. And those are different things. And I needed to know the difference in order to become what I've become. She held his gaze. So in a way, and I say this without any satisfaction, you sending me away was the best thing you ever did for me. Not because you intended it to help me, you didn't, but it did. Silas Hartwell sat across from his daughter and said nothing for a moment. And then, with the particular slowness of a man who is not accustomed to this kind of reckoning and is doing it anyway. Your mother would have known, he said. She always said, she used to tell me I looked at you wrong, that I was measuring you against the wrong thing. He stopped. I didn't listen. The mention of her mother landed the way it always did, softly and with an ache. No, Abigail said. You didn't. I'm sorry, he said. For the letter, for the breakfast, for all of it. The things I said, and the things I allowed you to believe about yourself by not... He shook his head. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about forgiveness. What it was actually for, who it actually served. She had thought about this before, in the abstract, and had arrived at a position she still believed. Forgiveness was not about the person being forgiven. It was about refusing to let someone else's failure live inside you forever, taking up the space that belonged to better things. I forgive you, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply. Not because what you did was small, but because I'm not willing to carry it. He looked at her. That doesn't mean we go back to what we were, she said. There's no going back. I'm Abigail Whitaker now. I live on a ranch in Montana with a man who sees me exactly as I am and considers that a gift. She paused. But I won't carry the weight of your mistakes anymore. I'm putting it down. That's what forgiving you means. He nodded. Once. Slowly. He looked like a man who had expected less and received something he didn't know how to fully hold. I'd like to... He stopped. I'd like to know you. Going forward. If that's... Write to me, she said. Don't arrive unannounced. Write, and I'll write back. We'll see what's possible. He nodded again. She stood up. Caleb is a good man, she said. Better than you described to Caldwell. I want you to know that. Her father looked at the table. I know, he said. I should have. Right, she said. If you want to start over, that's where it starts. She left the hotel. She rode back to the ranch in the autumn air with the mountains on the horizon and the grass gone gold on either side of the road, and she felt, not triumphant, not satisfied in the hard competitive sense, but clean. The particular cleanness of having set something down that you've been carrying for too long and discovering, once your hands are free, how much space there now is for everything else. Caleb was on the porch when she rode in. He watched her dismount, watched her tie the horse, watched her come up the porch steps. He was reading her face the way he'd learned to read it, carefully, without assumption, waiting for what she'd tell him. She stopped in front of him. He apologized, she said. Did you believe him? Yes, she said. Not completely, not yet, but the beginning of it was real. He nodded. I forgave him, she said, and I told him to write if he wants to start over. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Light, she said. Like I put something down that I'd been carrying so long, I forgot it had weight. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his arms. She walked into them. He held her, steady and certain, the way he did everything. And she stood there in the Montana autumn, with her face against his shoulder, and let the last of it go. Not the memories, not the knowledge of what had happened, but the weight of it. The grinding, constant background weight of being someone's disappointment. She let it go. He held her until she was ready to step back. When she did, she looked at his face and said, "The fire." He blinked. "What? You said you'd start the fire," she said. "I said I'd be back before supper." He looked at her. "I didn't start it yet," he admitted. "Caleb." "I was on the porch," he said, with great dignity. "Waiting." She looked at him. Something moved through her, warm and enormous, and absolutely certain. "Go start the fire," she said. "I'll be right in." He went inside. She stood on the porch for one moment alone. She looked at the ranch, the barn where Pete was finishing the evening rounds, the corral where the horses moved in the last light, the windmill turning slow, the land running out in every direction, enormous and real and hers. She looked at all of it. She thought about Silas Hartwell saying you should be grateful someone is willing to take you. She thought about the woman who had packed one trunk and walked out a front door without looking back and made herself a promise. She thought about a water trough and a supply room and a forged signature and a debt clause and a town meeting and a letter from Helena and a man who said, "Look at all of it," like he already trusted her before she'd earned it. She thought about Ruth saying, "You're the kind of woman this country was built on." She thought it about Pete saying, "You're good for this place." She thought about Caleb standing at the bottom of porch steps, looking at her with gray eyes that saw her, really saw her, from the very first moment. From inside the house, she heard the fire catch. She heard Caleb moving in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of the end of a working day, the particular ordinary music of a life she had built with her own hands, from nothing but a trunk and a promise, and the absolute refusal to accept someone else's version of who she was. She went inside. She hung up her coat. She went to the kitchen and stood beside him at the stove, and they made supper together the way they had come to do everything, side by side, talking about the day, about Pete's assessment of the barn roof repair, about the letter they would write together to the families east of Caldwell's land, about whether the kitchen garden could be expanded before the first frost. Ordinary things, real things, her things. She set the table for two. She looked at the two places, the lamplight between them, the recipe book on the windowsill where she had put it on her first night and where it had remained. Caleb brought the food to the table and sat down across from her. He looked at her. She looked at him. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They ate. Outside, the Montana night came down enormous and full of stars, and the ranch settled into its quiet. And somewhere in the territory, the machinery of justice continued its work. And in a hotel in Hales Crossing, a man sat alone with a cup of cold coffee, and perhaps for the first time understood the full cost of what he had almost thrown away. And at this table, in this kitchen, in this home that had been built from honest work and hard evidence, and two people who had found each other at the exact moment they were each, finally, ready to be found. Abigail Hartwell was nobody's burden, nobody's mistake, nobody's problem to be arranged away. She was the woman who had walked into a broken place and made it whole, who had looked at a box of documents and seen what others missed, who had stood in a room full of strangers and spoken the truth without flinching, who had taken the cruelest thing ever said about her and used it as the first brick in the foundation of everything she would become. She was Abigail Whitaker. She was home, and she had built every inch of it herself.